Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Developing CCUS Projects in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast event. This is the second in a series of events that we're hosting in collaborations with the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy and U.S. Energy Association. So we're glad that you could join us today. These events were intended to be in person, given the kind of historic work that has been going on with 45Q and increased commitment to carbon capture. These events are intended to really bring project proponents together in a meaningful way to advance CCS. We had to take these virtually. As a result, we're actually seeing kind of huge interest. And so as we go through the event, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions and interact. If we're not able to get to your questions because of the huge amount of people who are on this webinar, certainly we hope you'll continue to engage, and we'll reach out if there's kind of a pressing issue we haven't answered. Sonia, do you want to go to the next slide? To that point, for everyone who is kind of affected by COVID, we want you to know that our thoughts are with you. Certainly this pandemic continues to be a struggle all over this country and globally, and we are hopeful that you and your families are safe and kind of will stay safe through this holiday season. So we are using the Zoom platform for this event. I have kind of highlighted some of the areas of control. So we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. Even our first keynote speaker from Secretary Tom Harris of the state of Louisiana would love to take your questions. So you will add those in the Q&A button where you can click to send any questions. There's also this chat function. I would say that's more of to send a message if you're having an issue with the platform. You can leave the meeting. You see that leave button there. So as participants, you actually are not able to mute or unmute, and we won't be using that raise hand feature. I'll only be taking questions from that Q&A, but we really want this session to be as interactive as possible. So encourage you throughout the sessions to send your questions. We will be doing some breakout sessions tomorrow, or hopefully we can have a little bit more face-to-face interaction. I will describe that process a little bit more at the break later in the day. Sonia, you want to go to the next slide? A little bit about the Global CCS Institute, for those of you who may not know us. We are an international think tank whose mission is to advance deployment of carbon capture for really the purpose of addressing global climate change. We think CCS technologies are an important set of technologies to mitigate carbon emissions from all types of emissions, whether it be from power sector, transportation sector, or the industrial sector. And we'll talk a lot about the industrial sector in this event on Louisiana. We have 6 locations. The staff here in the United States are mostly located out of the DC office, and we're working from home out of kind of houses around the DMV. Our headquarters is in Australia, and then we have offices in Japan, China, Brussels, and the UK. We really focus on 3 areas: creating intelligence. Hopefully you'll be on the lookout for our Global Status of CCS report, which will come out on December 1st. We do that annually, and it really is this compendium of all the news on CCS, and certainly 2020 has been a huge year for CCS. We do advocacy at an international, national, and subnational level, and we create connections both with our members and the broader community. We have 78 members of the Global CCS Institute. If you're interested in learning more about that, certainly reach out to me, and you can do that kind of via LinkedIn or email or kind of any other social media as well. I'm easy to find. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sonia? We have an exciting 2-day event planned that is really specific and we hope really focused on the Louisiana context. If you are coming to us from around the globe, we actually did another one of these events last month that was focused on Texas. That is available on our website, and we'll have one coming up that's focused on Colorado and Wyoming. So as I said, we do try to get this to be as engaged an event as possible. You can see the agenda here, And then on day 2, we will have breakout sessions as well. So without any kind of further delay, I'm going to introduce you to Secretary Tom Harris. He is from the Department of Natural Resources for the state of Louisiana. Louisiana has made some incredible announcements in 2020, including net zero emissions commitments and a focused kind of role on what CCUS, the role CCUS needs to play in that net zero emissions commitment. So I will hand it over to Secretary Harris. But again, if you have Q&A for him or questions for him throughout the session, just put them in the Q&A box and I will be asking them in just a bit. Thank you, Secretary Harris.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today, really to share information and ideas on what I believe is going to be the next great chapter, both for the state of Louisiana and for those critical industries that have chosen to do business here. I also want to thank the organizers with the Global CCS Institute for, excuse me, sorry about that. I want to thank, again, the organizers with Global CCS Institute for putting this webinar together. I really think the next 2 days are going to provide an opportunity for some robust discussions for the future of Louisiana and for our industries in the field of CCUS. Louisiana right now is in a unique position to help industry make the best of these new opportunities. Here we have recognized that we had the potential for carbon management in Louisiana for some time now. Even about 10 years ago, we began enacting laws to prepare the way that is legislation dealing with how carbon storage would be handled. About that same time, industry helped set up an infrastructure backbone with Denbury's Green Pipeline project crossing the state to Texas. That pipeline provides the potential to interconnect with carbon generating facilities throughout South Louisiana. I did notice on the agenda, Dan Cole with Denbury is going to be speaking a little bit later this afternoon. But for a while, really for about 8 or 9 years, not a lot happened. Of course, there was some talk about making carbon capture and sequestration a more mainstream issue. But it's just been the last 2 years that we've seen a lot of new interest and excitement in the possibilities for carbon intensive industries here. As the concept of carbon management's gained greater traction, Louisiana joined the governor's partnership. Governor Edwards joined for Louisiana back in 2018. And since then, we've worked to promote carbon capture initiatives through the State Carbon Capture Work Group and its partners. And over those 2 years, I've had the pleasure of meeting with a lot of different groups working on initiatives to promote carbon management projects. What we're seeing is markets are demanding ever greater management of carbon emissions. And the carbon management movement in industry's increasing participations, I see it as indications that market forces and federal policies are driving the energy, manufacturing, and chemical industries to do something with waste carbon. And it's federal incentive programs like 45Q are what's making carbon management an attractive growth industry for Louisiana. Here, we believe our mix of our natural structures and man-made assets that are already in place make for a great potential opportunity for industry making use of those evolving laws and tax breaks for carbon capture, use, and storage. Louisiana is already home to one of the world's largest concentrations of industrial facilities, providing CO2 capture opportunities that are in close proximity to one another. And those are located near deep, well-confined geologic storage options. That, with our existing industrial and pipeline transportation expertise and infrastructure, Louisiana is in a position to be a leading regional hub for a CO2 pipeline network and a destination point for carbon dioxide storage or use in enhanced oil recovery. One key point to consider is that in a more carbon sensitive economy, carbon management has the capacity to extend the lifetime of our hydrocarbon production industry and the use of that production to provide our energy and manufacturing feedstocks. Doing more to manage the carbon output really could help those hydrocarbon-based industries lessen their environmental footprint and ease that pressure on legislative and regulatory bodies being pushed by public demand to take some more drastic action. Where we stand in Louisiana with our strong background in drilling and injection technologies, as well as pipeline and petrochemical infrastructure, the idea of building up new economic development around carbon capture, around CCUS, seems like a custom-built opportunity with immediately recognizable benefits both for the state and our industries. Because for years, we've already played host to oil and gas operators making use of carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery on a number of different projects. We already have the regulatory framework and experience in place for dealing with carbon transport and injection. I believe that this is an important opportunity for Louisiana because our state sits in a unique position. We have tremendous storage potential for carbon. We have many industrial sources of it. We've got an existing infrastructure of pipelines and established pipeline right-of-ways. And we have oil and gas operators with both the knowledge and expertise to do enhanced oil recovery, and operators who have decades of experience in drilling and injection. We also have an ample supply of facilities that could benefit from new carbon management processes. The U.S. Energy Information Administration tells us that Louisiana ranks 5th in the nation in carbon dioxide emissions. So that makes our state a logical target for carbon management programs. Also, the makeup of our emission puts us in a key position for capture deployment. Nearly 60% of carbon dioxide emissions from Louisiana are from industrial facilities. Many of those provide high purity, low cost opportunities for carbon capture and compression. The bulk of carbon dioxide emission from other states and the rest of the nation are primarily from electric power generation and the transportation sector, where the cost to capture are considerably higher. The refining and chemical industries have potential advantages for carbon capture deployment due to key existing industrial processes that produce relatively pure streams of CO2, low cost of capture, and sufficient industry scale and just knowledge and experience. Our existing industrial base is also located in very close proximity to these large-scale geological storage opportunities. Through sequestration or enhanced oil recovery in oil fields, and also through injection beneath many confining layers with great potential for total storage of carbon dioxide. At the same time, we also have the nation's greatest density of industrial gas and petroleum product pipelines. These provide rights of way and also potential public acceptance of infrastructure that we can harness to support the build out of carbon dioxide pipeline infrastructure networks to serve our industrial base. Our energy assets, infrastructure, and existing industry presence provide conditions needed to commercially scale these CCUS projects in response to federal initiatives. Just 2 years ago in 2019, our state legislature acted to clear an important hurdle in our efforts to gain primacy from EPA on the regulation, permitting, and enforcement of carbon injection. They did that by aligning our existing state law on regulatory liability with federal law. What we've really tried to do is eliminate any roadblocks to getting primacy, primary enforcement, and permitting authority from EPA Region 6 on Class 6 injection well. In seeking to put this policy into effect, our Office of Conservation has been working with EPA to get that primacy. And the whole point of that, we're trying to get to the point where an operator who wants a Class 6 injection permit can go to Louisiana for permitting instead of EPA. You know, EPA's been great. We've worked with them for years, but compared to state agencies, we're just a whole lot better able to streamline our processes. We can get those permits turned around quickly, simply by nature of our location, our familiarity with local issues of geology and other concerns. And also we focus on a much smaller area than an entire EPA region. And that's been our objective, to try to eliminate uncertainties, market uncertainties that really drive decisions on investment in projects like this. We've already begun that process with EPA about 1.5 years ago. And what we found so far, EPA they've been very engaged and frankly pretty encouraging. They seem to be doing everything they can to help Louisiana prepare our case for that primacy. We've engaged both their regional and Washington, D.C. offices to assist us in drafting the rules. We've sent those to them. They're reviewing those. Steve Lee is the director of our Injection and Mining Division. He's been working closely with EPA and also offered for Louisiana DNR, Office of Conservation, to do an initial review of applications as they come in. So basically, EPA can check our work. I believe that will help build confidence with EPA and speed up the process for DNR getting primacy for Class 6 injection. We're working on that, and we believe we will be the third state to get primacy for Class 6 injection. So basically here in Louisiana, we have the geology, we have the industry, we have the infrastructure, we have the rules and regulations on the way. The statutes are already in place. What we're looking for now are those partnerships that make it all work, and the projects that become the first true steps toward both new opportunities for economic growth and the ability for Louisiana to expand the lifespan of our existing and traditional economic base. I'm hopeful that these talks today and tomorrow will not just be a one-shot discussion of interesting ideas, but part of an ongoing conversation with industry, leading to real carbon management projects that open the way for even larger scale initiatives. I believe that Louisiana is perfectly positioned to benefit from the growth of carbon management industry and the experience and technology already being used by the energy industry here. This can serve companies well in seeking to develop our advantages to the benefit of really the state, the environment, and those companies that have chosen to do their business here. In closing, I want to make it clear Louisiana is working to pave the way for carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects here. We already have all the puzzle pieces in place. And as I said before, we're really trying to eliminate uncertainty, trying to get not depend on federal agencies or others to make those permit decisions and to hold our destiny in our own hands. We can do it safely here. We've got the know-how. Excuse me, I'm sorry. No, thank you. That's really it, Patricia. I'd be more than happy to take any questions. I've had people in and out of my office. I apologize. The phone's been ringing, people trying to empty the trash, but look forward to taking questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Secretary Harris. And yeah, I mean, you know, hopefully maybe for some of our panelists today, we'll see some pets coming kind of through their screens as well. You can always hope for something exciting to happen. We do have some questions. So let me start with one on the state's kind of net zero emissions commitment. And, you know, a corollary kind of question that was asked regarding kind of acceptance for these types of projects. So obviously Louisiana, as a coastal state, as a state that deals directly with a lot of hurricanes, is probably seeing very close at hand the effects of climate change. How is that kind of perspective from a state that's really, you know, kind of dealing with climate change? How is that influencing the governor's decisions and your urgency around CCUS projects?
I think that's really been a key driver. You really have to visit here to understand our geography, our geology, and you can literally from the Gulf of Mexico go miles inland and gain 18 inches of vertical relief. So we're seeing the effects of climate change and sea level rise more here than anywhere else in the nation. And we also have been blessed with oil and gas and that petrochemical industry that's served Louisiana very well for decades. I think it makes sense for Louisiana to lead the charge in taking some of that, those industrial emissions, take advantage of federal tax credits and laws to inject that carbon safely deep underground in secure geologic storage formations. We'll also reap most of the benefit here, because every inch of sea level rise impacts us disproportionately already. Very good question. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we've had several questions on the Class 6 primacy that you kind of referred to. There are questions regarding, do you have any knowledge on timing of that? If and once you get that ability to do Class 6 well permitting, what do you think will be the kind of the permit timelines? I mean, we've certainly heard from some project proponents that kind of the timeline they think it would get to get a Class 6 well approved by the EPA is a concern. Does the state think that they can bring that timeline down? And then, you know, we had a question regarding what is that the main advantage for the state doing primacy? Is it a timeline issue? And there was a follow-up question, would it make sense for a state without oil wells to do this, or do you need the experience with oil to be able to manage this effectively?
Okay, I'll start with I guess the last one first. No, you really would not need to have existing oil and gas exploration and production. Certainly, there are expert operators in that field who go anywhere in the country where it's profitable to produce. So I think the key thing for a state was, do you have the geology for storage of carbon? Do you have the industry industries that produce relatively pure streams of CO2 that are cost effective to capture. And, you know, are those two in close proximity to each other, the sources and the storage formations? Because, you know, if you have to pipeline it all the way across the state and that infrastructure is not already in place, it may not be cost effective. So, I mean, we happen to be fortunate here that we have both the storage and the sources in close proximity. We have pipeline infrastructure in place. But I guess going back to the first part of that question, we've been working on with EPA on obtaining primacy. Steve Lee is the director of the Injection and Mining Division here at DNR. And what we're looking at right now, we're looking at first quarter of 2022. So 14 to 16 months out is the latest I've heard. Sooner the better as far as we're concerned. We're already staffing up to prepare for that workload. But what I've heard from Steve as recently as yesterday is that we didn't prepare enough. You know, we've already received the first Class 6 injection well permit application for Louisiana. EPA's reviewing that now. We're working in parallel with them. And, you know, there are more lined up, literally a pipeline. They're coming this way, whether we're ready or not. I just, you know, and this is true. We have a coastal use permitting program here where we work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We turn permits around in roughly a quarter of the time that the Corps does, and they have good people. But you know, we know the area, we know the people, we know the geology, and there's no doubt in my mind that we can get it done faster than the federal government, and we want to take advantage of that.
Okay, I'll ask one more question. And again, this was one that seemed to get answered quite a few times. Will the state be providing any financial subsidies or kind of incentives in addition to 45Q? And if they're not financial incentives, you know, could there be other incentives that the state provides?
I think that would be great. I am not holding my breath. I really don't believe that's going to be happening in the Louisiana legislature. They do not seem inclined to do so. Anything that the legislature, they're very willing to take other steps that don't involve purse strings to clear the way for more investment in Louisiana. But I really believe that the financial incentives are going to have to come from the federal government.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Harris. And I apologize, as expected, we had a lot of questions that we couldn't get through. But, you know, this early on, I'm going to try to keep us to time and move on to Jeff Erickson's presentation. But we greatly appreciate it, Secretary Harris. For those of you who have more questions, we will have Jason Langclose, who's also from the Department of Natural Resources. He'll be on a panel tomorrow, and we'll be running a breakout session tomorrow afternoon with other representatives from the state. So there's a lot more opportunity to have this really kind of direct question and answer session with state representatives. And we thank the whole kind of department for making themselves available for this event.
Thank you, Patricia.
Okay. So moving on to Jeff Erickson. He is the General Manager of Client Engagement at the Global CCS Institute. He's going to talk about the status of CCS, both in the US and around the world. I discussed that we are a global organization, and he will kind of represent that global position in his remarks coming up now. So I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. Just a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, very good, thank you. So my role is to provide a broader context and help folks to understand that the U.S. or in fact the state of Louisiana is not the only place that activity is occurring with respect to CCS. It's occurring all around the world, and I'll give you a sense of that in just a minute. But I do want to pick up on a couple of things that Secretary Harris said that I think are particularly important. First, it was very encouraging once again to hear a high-level official in the state government that's responsible for environmental protection to talk in a way that he is, in a sense, pitching investment in the state and identifying that the state of Louisiana is a great place to invest. It's almost very similar to the way states are looking to encourage industrial manufacturers to build a new automotive plant or chemical plant, whatever it might be. And now that competition among states for investing in the states has turned to the CCUS industry. So very encouraging sign, I think, to demonstrate that there's demand for this investment across multiple states in the US and in fact all around the world. The other thing that Secretary Harris said that I'd just like to reiterate is he said that he hoped that this would be the beginning of an ongoing discussion about how to invest in the state of Louisiana. And indeed, this is really the goal of this series of workshops, is to be location specific and to drive deeper conversation, help folks to understand how you can actually get projects done in these particular locales. And hopefully that will lead to new project opportunities, new partnerships, new ways to work together. So thank you to Secretary Harris for helping us with those messages. And like I said, I'd just like to emphasize that I think those are important aspects of the work that we're doing over the next 2 days here in the conversation that we're having. So as I said, I'm going to step back and show you what's happening outside of the Gulf Coast of the US in just a few minutes. And I have a fairly unique opportunity to talk with folks, my colleagues in Melbourne, Australia, and Beijing, and Tokyo, and Brussels, and London every week. And it's been amazing to watch the trajectory of things like public health happen over the last eight months or so, but also the fact that momentum in CCS investment and CCS development is occurring all around the world. So Sonia, if you can just go to the map slide, please. This is a snapshot of the CCS projects that are around the world. The large red bubbles that you see are those commercial facilities that are in operation or under construction around the world. Smaller ones are those that are in that are pilot sites or test sites. And there's a few things that are immediately obvious. The first is the amount of activity that's occurring in the United States, and particularly not just those that are in development, but particularly projects. There's this mix of projects that are both in operation, have been in operation for a while, plus those that are currently in development. And the second thing that you'll see, and I'll go deeper on what's happening in the US in just a minute. The second thing, if you move from west to east, is that you see a lot of activity in Europe. And again, both there's some existing projects, particularly in Norway, but there's a lot of blue that's going on there, a lot of projects that are in development. And it's really been remarkable to see the level of commitment by both the private sector and public sector for CCS just over the last couple of years. Some of the more prominent projects in Europe include the line skip project, which used to be called the Norway Full-Scale Project. Line skip is Norwegian for long ship, so it playing off their maritime heritage. But that involves two sources of CO2, one from a cement plant, the other one from a waste to energy plant, and storage offshore. The Portos project is another project that's in development in Europe. And the thing that's remarkable about that is the fact that it's not unique. In fact, many of the projects in Europe are focused on ports. And as you think about ports, large, an area of multiple CO2 sources, fairly compact area-wise, and they have an authority, if you will, a port authority that often owns the land in between, and it's an ideal opportunity for a project that can collect from CO2 from multiple sources into one trunk line, and then to either a single storage facility or multiple storage facility. And that takes me to the third thing that I think is particularly remarkable about what is happening in Europe. And in fact, this model is spreading around the world. And that is the focus on the hub and cluster operating model of facilities. Nearly all of the projects that are in development in Europe have more than one source of CO2. That we're seeing that not just in ports, but also combinations of other facilities, and the hub and cluster model is taking off all around the world. Now, in fact, in North America, we already have what can be seen as a hub and cluster model, and that's north of the border in Alberta. The Alberta Carbon Trunk Line is a facility, a cluster of facilities. Actually, there's two that are currently providing CO2 to a trunk line for use in enhanced oil recovery. That's from a refinery and a fertilizer plant. But they're currently only using about 10% of the capacity of the pipeline. So a great opportunity to grow as more industrial facilities get built and come online to capture carbon in the heartland, the industrial heartland of Alberta. We move a bit further to the east, and you'll see a cluster of projects in the Middle East. And again, this is an area with a lot of activity, a lot of interest from both governments and businesses. In the United Arab Emirates, and Abu Dhabi in particular, that is home to the first CCS project on a steel plant. That's been in operation for about 3 years. And ADNOC, which operates the CO2 injection for that CO2, has just committed to just about double the capacity of the CO2 that's being captured there on an annual basis. Moving further east, a lot of activity in China. We expect to see even more activity in China as a result of President Xi's recent announcement for the country to be net zero emissions by 2060. And we're seeing an uptick in interest in CCS across numerous agencies, not just in the federal government, but also in the regional governments as well. And that, of course, translates into interest from industry in China. Finally, in Australia, the Gorgon project on the west coast of Australia has been in operation for over a year now. They're injecting more than 2 million tons per year of CO2 at an LNG export facility, and the capacity of the existing capture and storage equipment there is about 4 million tons per year, which they expect to ramp up to fairly shortly. Next slide, please, Sonia. So I mentioned this word momentum. I think that's the operative word as things stand right now in the CCS world. You can see that this is a chart of the number of projects that have been in operation or development over the last decade, and you can see that just after the economic crisis and the recession of 2009, there was a very high level of investment in developing CCS projects that has waned substantially right on through 2017. But you'll see over the last 2 years, to the right of the chart, significant uptick in investment in CCS projects, interest in CCS project. And as Patricia noted, we're about to release our status report for the global status for CCS. Our flagship report will be coming out in just a couple of weeks. And there'll be a 2020 chart there that's going to show even more growth in the number of facilities and the amount of CO2 that's being both planned for and being captured on an annual basis. Now, to the right there, you can see that we've captured about 270 million tons of anthropogenic CO2 to date since we started tracking such, and currently we're capturing about 40 million tons of CO2 per year. Sonia, next slide, please. So 40 million tons, just to put that into some context. Is that a lot? Well, it's about the amount of CO2 emissions that's emitted from about 4.7 million houses. That, by the way, is just a bit more than all of the houses in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. It's equivalent to the CO2 emissions from about 8.8 million cars, which is about twice as many cars that are on the road in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. Equivalent to about the CO2 that's being sequestered from 53 million acres of forest, And again, that's just about equivalent to the amount of forest that exists in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. To put it in some further context, one of the largest concentrated solar farms in the world is Ibampa in California. And that's reducing CO2 emissions compared to natural gas-fired electricity by about 400,000 tons per year. So 40 million tons, the current capture and storage capacity of existing facilities, it's worth about 100 of the largest solar farms in the world. That sounds like a lot, pretty substantial. Well, it certainly is. On the other hand, it's not nearly enough. The International Energy Agency has indicated in several of its reports, the latest one that was just released, the Energy Technology Perspectives released just a couple of months ago, indicates that we're going to need more than 4 billion tons per year of CO2 in an optimized carbon reduction approach by mid-century, by 2050. So that's about 100 times the amount of CO2 that we're currently capturing and storing on a global basis annually currently. Next slide, please. So a bit of a drill down on what that mix of existing and planned CCS projects look like. You can see on the left-hand slide, we're identifying the various sectors where the CO2 emissions are coming from, and a couple of things that are remarkable here. First of all, Sonia, if you could click once. Yep, there are currently 21 facilities that are operational. That does include Petronova, which is currently not operating as a result of difficult economic conditions. And it also includes the Lost Cabin facility, which is recovering from a fire and is expecting to be operational again later this year. Currently 21 facilities that are operational. And click 3 times for me, Sonia. 3 in construction, 2 in China, and 1 in the Gulf Coast in the US. And then 16 in advanced development. In other words, they've completed a feasibility study, and 19 in early stage development. And there are literally scores of additional facilities that are scores of additional ideas, which may in fact turn into additional facilities, but currently aren't developed enough to get into that early development stage. A couple of things too that are remarkable about this slide. First, you can see that in the past, there's been an awful lot of facilities that have been located on natural gas processing facilities, and very few in the power sector. You can see just 2 in coal-fired power, Boundary Dam and Petronova. But if you look to the right and those that are in development, there's a cluster of projects, CCS projects, that are being developed in both the coal-fired sector and the gas-fired power sector. So that is in large part thanks to 45Q here in the US, but some of that activity is also occurring outside of the US. Next slide, please. I mentioned there's a lot of activity in the US. This is just intended to provide you a bit of a graphic. 10 of the 21 facilities that are currently operational are based in the US, and 14 of the 16 that are in advanced development are currently in the US. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the emerging operating model for CCS facilities is the hub and cluster model. So rather than one source, one sink, we're seeing multiple sources, trunk pipeline, and 1 or more storage facilities. That is, as I said, the kind of the preferred model. It certainly reduces operational risk, cross-party risk, and financial risk. The latest hub and cluster project to be announced is right there in the Gulf Coast area. Gulf Coast Sequestration announced a project in Louisiana that they have a storage facility for, and they're working now with emitters to line up the sources of emissions. They're expecting, once operational, initial operation to be about 2.7 million tons per year captured, and the ultimate capacity of that storage facility is 80 million tons of CO2. Next slide, please. So we talked about the operational model. Just a note about the business model. This is an analysis that we did on those facilities that are currently in operation. There are, let me say, there's 21 facilities around the world that have figured out how to make or save money. Now, there's a lot of enabling conditions. The one thing that is remarkable, and I provided some notes there so that you can see in a little more clarity, those columns are identified up on top. But you can see that in every case, there are multiple conditions, positive conditions that enable better economics for CCS. And that varies by both geography and local and industrial operating conditions. Last slide, please. Last thing I'd like to say is there's some things as we look ahead, things that we can be pretty confident are going to continue as far as trends go. And the first is climate change awareness. And it's been really remarkable. And let me put the first two together. It's been really remarkable to see over the last 12 months or so, the number of both governments and businesses that have committed to net zero emissions. It wasn't that long ago when companies were being seen as climate leaders if they would announce a 40 or 50% reduction in emissions. Now, in order to be identified as a leader on climate change, you really have to commit to net zero emissions. It's no longer how far will you go, it's how fast will you go. ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations in investment continues to be a significant factor in decarbonization. And CCS is an important element of decarbonization. So that linkage, that tie is getting closer all the time. Hydrogen. We're continuing to see hydrogen as an important element of the future, not just of the electricity sector, but also for heating and mobility. And CCS can enable low-cost hydrogen production as well. Finally, we're not seeing any waning of continued U.S. leadership on CCUS. We expect that to continue well into the future. Next slide, please. Last thing I'll say is that there's some things that are very much uncertain and will have an impact on the pace of deployment of CCS. First uncertainty is the longer term or midterm impact of the COVID, the impact of the COVID virus on the economy. And related to that is then what's the future of fossil fuels, not just in this recovery phase, but how quickly and how far will companies and countries go to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Geopolitics is certainly a factor. CCS is an international business and it requires cooperation across national boundaries. And I'm sure many of you know that there's a lot of international tensions right now. So whether we can get through those tensions to find cooperation across different countries is quite unknown. The color of hydrogen, what I mean by that, green hydrogen, which is produced by hydrolysis and the use of renewables, or blue hydrogen, which is also low or zero carbon hydrogen with the use of use of fossil fuels coupled with CCS. And finally, what's the revenue model? There are many that are out there. We're still in the exploratory phase, and we are by no means determined what the preferred revenue model is, and that too will continue to vary based on local conditions. Last slide. Just a shout out to our status report that's getting released in just a couple of weeks. A lot of the numbers that I called out here are going to change a bit, but I think the messaging that you heard today is not going to change at all. As we release our new status report in just a couple of weeks, we will be making an announcement about a webinar that will be launching that status report on the 1st, and then you'll also be able to download the report from our website beginning on the 1st. With that, Patricia, back over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I know that there were a lot of questions from Jeff's presentation on what's going on in various places around the world. As we said, this was just a brief interlude on the rest of the globe. We're kind of focusing back on Louisiana, so sorry we don't have time for those questions. But I would direct you back to our website. We've done a lot of webinars on different regions around the world. You can go under our resource section and see any of our previous webinars on those topics. Moving forward, we're going to have Keith Tracy join us here. He is a principal at Elysian Ventures. So not only is he actually kind of a developer looking at CCS projects, but has done kind of a lot of thinking through the history of 45Q. So he's going to give what we think is a really practical presentation on a 45Q and how it can be used. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end of Keith's presentation, as well as he'll be doing one of those interactive breakout sessions tomorrow. So certainly keep your questions flowing, and I'll come back on kind of halfway through this session and we'll do some Q&A. Thanks, Keith, for joining us.
Great, thanks, Patricia. Looks like we're able to see the slides, maybe in a little different format than I'm used to, but maybe we can go full screen there. But it's my pleasure to be with you today, and I want to give thanks to Global CCS Institute and the U.S. Energy Association for organizing this workshop. I've been in the carbon capture and storage industry for 14 years, and I'm a principal of Elysian Ventures, a CCS development, a project development company. We have one announced project under commercial feed study currently that will capture CO2 from a natural gas power plant. And we have many others in the development pipeline, including industrial facilities. In our time together today, our goal is to provide an overview of the Section 45Q tax credit program. Next slide, please. If we can go to the next slide. There we go, thank you. At its highest level, 45Q is a federal tax credit incentive to capture CO2. And then once the CO2 is captured, either utilizing the CO2 to make a product or permanently storing it underground. The incentive is based on physical activity on a per metric ton basis. Generating more tax credits if more CO2 is captured. For new projects, the credits last for 12 years from the date of first capture operations. And as we'll discuss later, the value of the credits are increasing every year. Essentially, 45Q has placed a price on carbon in the US. Next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful up front to provide a sort of a checklist of things that someone would have to think about in order to qualify for 45Q credits. And this checklist will guide our presentation today. And we take into account not only the 2018 amendments to 45Q, but also the beginning of construction notice that the IRS issued and the tax equity partnership revenue procedure that was issued in February of this year, as well as the proposed regulations that were issued in June. So we will talk about what's being captured and how and where it has to be captured. We'll also talk about an important deadline for starting construction of a carbon capture project that will qualify. Then we'll turn to how the CO2 can be stored and under what requirements. Importantly, we'll focus on who gets to claim the tax credit, including someone called tax equity. We'll also briefly discuss the proposed recapture regulations. And we'll clarify how much the credit is worth today and in future years. And we'll wrap up with some additional thoughts. Next slide, please. So 45Q credits are based on the amount of carbon oxide that is captured. I'm just going to say CO2 since the vast amount of carbon oxide that will qualify for the credits is CO2. The CO2 must be captured from being emitted into the air or is directly captured from the air by a direct air capture plant or a DAC plant. So whether it's a DAC plant or an industrial facility, the CO2 has to be measured where it's captured, and then the amount of captured CO2 has to be verified where it's stored. And it can be stored whether it's injected underground, disposed of underground, or it's utilized to make some product. There is a special rule for oil and gas, an enhanced oil recovery project that produces CO2 with some of the oil that's produced. That CO2, when it's recaptured and recycled and re-injected, you don't qualify for 45Q for that. Next slide, please. So the CO2 has to be captured using carbon capture equipment. And there's a picture of carbon capture equipment in the background there that is actually operating today and capturing CO2. Carbon capture equipment is a term that's used throughout the statute, but was never defined. The proposed regulation definition that came out in June this summer was nicely broad. Practically any piece of equipment that has to do with diverting the CO2 from being emitted, as long as that piece of equipment is upstream and being loaded into a pressure vessel or being delivered into the inlet of the pipeline. The expansive list includes lots of pieces of equipment that you would expect, like compressors and dehydrators, but also includes less expected items such as power generators that might be owned by other people, or the flue gas duct that might be owned by the host plant. The list is not quite the same as in the beginning of construction guidance that came out in February, but it's close. And we anticipate those two definitions will hopefully be harmonized in the final regulations. In some instances, the proposed regulations indicated that all of the listed pieces of equipment had to be owned by the same owner, which is actually kind of inconsistent with how carbon capture works at some facilities, because it's not a cookie cutter approach at each facility. Many commenters to the IRS sought to clarify this point. And so the list of equipment, maybe it merely becomes examples rather than requirements. We hope to get clarity from the IRS when they issue final regulations, hopefully in the next few months. Next slide, please. So now that we have carbon capture equipment, we need to know where it has to be installed. And it has to be installed at something called a qualified facility. So this is either 1, an industrial facility, 2, a power plant, or 3, a DAC plant. The industrial facility definition includes combustion sources of CO2, but also manufacturing process, which any manufacturing process, and that was defined in the regulations very broadly. Of course, the historic exclusion of CO2 production wells was also carried into the regulations. One note on power plants, the regulations appear to narrowly define a power plant as only those that sell power, such as on the grid. So on-site or distributed power plants don't appear to be included. This is actually helpful because at the bottom of the slide, as it indicates down there, power plants have to capture at least 500,000 metric tons per year of CO2, but other facilities only have to capture 100,000 metric tons. Of course, utilization has a 25,000 metric ton threshold in most instances. The regulations allow these minimum thresholds to be annualized so that a carbon capture project doesn't have to start in January just to have enough, the full 12 months to meet the threshold in the year. And it allows a project to start much later in the year, and you just annualize it based on a pro rata basis. On the right, there's an applicable facility description, and the rules allow for 45Q credits for some of the older carbon capture projects under the pre-2018 program if they never claimed the credits under the old program. That's a picture of one there. And they're allowed to claim credits under the new higher program. Next slide, please. One quick word on direct air capture plants, which remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. In 45Q speak, the DAC plant is effectively both the qualified facility as well as the carbon capture equipment. Their annual minimum threshold is 100,000 metric tons a year, and they have the same requirements to measure the CO2 up front and verify the CO2 when it's stored. Next slide, please. So now that we know what our carbon capture equipment is and where it will be located at a qualified facility, the next question is, when does all this have to be built? There's 2 separate timing requirements to think about here. First, construction has to start sometime before January 1 of 2024. This deadline applies to the qualified facility or the emitter. It also applies to the carbon capture equipment, unless the qualified facility to be built has carbon capture in its design, but they plan to build that piece of it later. Okay, so we have to start construction by a certain date, but what does it mean to start construction? The IRS issued Notice 2020-12 earlier this year to explain exactly that. And it was heavily based on similar guidance regarding wind and solar tax credits. For example, as long as certain physical work is accomplished by the deadline, the requirement's met. And the notice contains a list of examples of the types of physical work that will start construction, such as pouring foundations or even buying certain equipment, even if that equipment is not physically on site. Another way to start construction is to incur at least 5% of the total capital cost of the project. And you have to make sure that you've counted all the possible capital expenses, but that can also include the funding of a FEED study. Another important issue, once construction has started, how long do I have to complete the project and start operations? Generally, the rule is 6 years, which is more favorable than the 4 years that the IRS allowed for wind energy projects. Next slide, please. So we next need to think about where the CO2 is going to be stored. We have two general options under 45Q to qualify for those credits. One is utilization, and the other is secure geologic storage. So let's first talk about utilization. That's defined by the statute as doing some photosynthesis, such as growing algae, or another way to utilize the CO2 is to chemically convert it into some other material or compound, such as the project on the right where CO2 is converted into baking soda. And then there's this third category, which is more of kind of a catch-all provision, which basically says the CO2 can be utilized for any other purpose for which a commercial market exists. This provision's been receiving increased attention lately, including in the public comments to the proposed regulations this past summer. And many are advocating for what is the intention behind that provision. We anticipate the final regulations will provide additional clarity here. Next slide, please. Continuing with utilization, there's a requirement in 45Q that the amount of CO2 that's stored through utilization has to be determined based on a life cycle analysis. The proposed regulations provide some explanation about the required LCA, such as having to use the ISO 14044 standard. And the IRS says you can't have self-certification, you have to have third-party certification. Agency involvement is pretty heavy here, where the DOE is going to perform a technical review, and then the IRS will approve the LCA report after consulting with the DOE and the EPA. The proposed regulations state that a full life cycle analysis is required rather than a gate-to-gate approach. But there's still many unanswered questions after seeing the proposed regulations on utilization, and I've tried to list some of those there for your review later. Next slide, please. Instead of utilization, the other option for where CO2 is going to be permanently stored is underground in what the statute calls secure geologic storage. This underground storage can be in many different kinds of reservoirs and formations, but saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs are popular choices. When talking about secure geologic storage, the 45Q credit program distinguishes between injection and disposal. Injection is where the CO2 is injected into oil or gas formation for enhanced oil recovery or enhanced gas recovery. And in the process, the CO2 is permanently stored in the reservoir. The picture on the right is a CO2 EOR injection well. Disposal, on the other hand, is where the CO2 is put underground and is not used for EOR or EGR, such as a saline aquifer. These distinctions are important because, as we'll see later, the 45Q credit value is different for injection versus disposal. Also, how secure geologic storage is demonstrated is different for both categories. So for injection, secure geologic storage requires either compliance with subpart RR of the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program or compliance with the ISO standard 27916. For disposal, on the other hand, only the subpart RR method is available to show secure geologic storage. I might mention here that subpart RR requires EPA approval of what's called a monitoring, reporting, and verification plan. 2 of those have been approved for disposal, 3 have been approved for injection. and more are in the pipeline to be approved. If the ISO standard, however, is the chosen method for demonstrating that the CO2 is stored securely, then a third-party qualified engineer or geologist must provide specific certifications that will have to be provided to the IRS, or credits will be disallowed under that method. Next slide, please. So now that the carbon capture equipment is placed in service at a qualified facility, and the CO2 is being utilized or stored in secure geologic storage, then we'll need to determine who gets the 45Q credit for all this activity. 45Q credits may be claimed by the owner of the carbon capture equipment. Now, the owner is obligated to physically store the CO2, or the owner can sign a contract and have their contracting party utilize or inject or dispose of the CO2. I'll call that party the storage co. So if the owner decides to contract with storage co, then there has to be a binding written contract between those parties. The IRS proposed regulations impose some limitations on that contract. Some of those I've listed here. For example, you have to have the ability to enforce the obligations to utilize, inject, and dispose. If storage co is doing injecting or disposing, they're going to have to follow the rules on recapture regulations as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And some of that contract information has to be reported to the IRS. So to repeat, the owner of the carbon capture equipment gets to claim the 45Q credit, but that owner has a unique ability, and I don't think this is found in any other federal tax program, and that's this. The owner has the ability to transfer the tax credit to the storage co that we talked about earlier. The IRS calls that person the credit claimant. It's the company that's doing the utilization or injection or disposal. So the owner can make this election to transfer the credit to the credit claimant. They can transfer some of the credits, all the credits. They can transfer it to multiple credit claimants. There's a lot of flexibility there. And there's one more big topic related to who gets to claim the tax credits, and that's on our next slide. I'm not going to cover everything on this slide, but I want to introduce you to our friends, tax equity. 45Q is a very significant tax credit. Tax credits only offset tax liabilities. So in some instances, this can be a lot of tax credits. For example, a 1 million metric ton project in 2026 is going to generate $50 million in 45Q tax credits for disposal. Many carbon capture projects do not involve parties that have tax liabilities of $50 million per year. But there are some taxpayers who do have that kind of appetite for tax credits. And when they invest in carbon capture projects like this, and they receive an allocation of the tax credits, they're called tax equity. And the IRS recognizes this commercial reality. And as with other tax credits in the past, the IRS has issued a revenue procedure that explains the rules, if you will, for how a tax equity investor can make this kind of investment. For example, the investor has to pay at least 20% of their total investment up front, and at least half of their investment can't be contingent. The IRS has provided some favorable provisions, such as excluding operational expense when thinking about the 50% pay-go, and allowing take-or-pay or supplier-pay contracts. There's much more detail that your tax lawyer would probably be happy to explain to you. But the big takeaway here is that IRS has provided pretty clear guidance on how these tax equity partnerships can be structured. And the tax equity investor takes on the risk of those structures. And this guidance is one of the biggest things that the tax equity market was waiting on in order to enter into the 45Q credit business. I will say that a little additional clarity on economic substance doctrine in disposal situations would be helpful. And we anticipate that in the final regulations. Next slide, please. So since 2008, when the 45Q statute was first adopted, they told the IRS that they needed to adopt regulations to explain how the IRS might recapture or claw back or disallow the 45Q credits in the unlikely event that the CO2 injected or disposed of underground were to somehow leak. Now I want to start this discussion on recapture with a couple of facts. A large major CO2 EOR company with decades of experience in carbon capture and storage has publicly stated that their storage ratio exceeds 99%. The amount that was not stored is not because it leaked from the reservoir, but because of operational upset situations on the surface. In addition, a smaller CO2 EOR operator recently released their information from over a decade of operations. Their storage percentage was in excess of 99.90%, with none of it leaking from the reservoir. This is consistent with the general experience in the EOR industry, and those with disposal operations are not having reservoir leakage either. The second thing I want to point out here is on this slide, there's an italicized part there in the middle. I call this the current year offset principle because the regulations say that there is no potential for recapture unless the amount of CO2 that leaked from the reservoir exceeds the amount that was injected that year. Well, based on the track record of the EOR industry, if this recapture rule had been around for the last 50 years, there would have never been a recapture event. If somehow there is a recapture event, the IRS has adopted rules. They take a last in, first out approach to recapture, and they look back 5 years from the date of last injection, unless the MRV plan, that period ends before that time. Next slide, please. You're probably familiar with the value of the 45Q tax credits, but they're about $20 a metric ton today for injection into EOR or EGR, and almost $32 per metric ton for disposal. Those numbers climb over the next 5 years to $35 and $50 per metric ton. And then after 2027, those amounts are adjusted based on inflation. Some examples are shown at the bottom left, where a 100,000 metric ton per year project, if it began next year, would generate between $40 and $60 million in tax credits over the 12-year time period. And that's a minimum sized industrial facility or DAC plant project. A minimum sized power plant project would generate about $200 million or more in tax credits over that same time period. Next slide, please. Now, briefly, a word about carbon capture facilities that existed in early 2018. Those facilities can install additional carbon capture equipment and qualify for the new credit values in limited circumstances. Also, an older facility can retrofit and render their project to be a new facility and eligible for the higher credit values if the used components of that property do not exceed 20% of the total value. The older credit values also sunset once 75 million metric tons have been claimed. The IRS has been issuing annual notices since 2013 to report on the status of when that sunset will occur. And based on the most recent information from this last summer, the trend of claims indicates that those old credit values will likely sunset next year. Next slide, please. The proposed regulations contain a number of instances in which the IRS is collecting information about many of the items we've discussed, including who's claiming the credit, who they've contracted with, where the carbon capture equipment is located, where the qualified facility is. They want to know where the CO2 is going, including an EPA ID information for the storage facility. And if the credit's transferred to that credit claimant, they want many details about those transactions as well. So there's a fair amount of reporting requirements here. The last statement's very important. The regulation says that credits won't be allowed if all the required information is not timely provided. So if you miss one piece of the required information, you could run the risk of the credits not being allowed at all. Developing a checklist of what needs to be reported will be very critical. Next slide. As we think about carbon capture and storage projects, there are a number of potential business partners that will be needed on any project. Some of these functions may be internalized If you're a host plant where you're emitting CO2 today and you want to capture the CO2, you may have some of that. On the other side, it may be an operator who is injecting or disposing and may provide some of these services inside their company as well. But in many instances, most of these business partners are going to be needed in one way or another. It's a helpful list for you there. Next slide. A final point here on timing. There's some clarity needed on when certain 45Q rules are applicable. And the purpose of this slide is to explain that issue. May not be applicable for most, but the statute's effective for 2018 and forward. But the proposed regulations, while they can be relied on immediately, they only, for most people, will apply for 2019 and forward. And the proposed regulations indicate that the final regulations will be effective beginning the year after those regulations are published. So if the final regulations come out in 2021, they're not going to be applicable until 2022. It creates a little bit of a mess as to what rules apply when. So it's something that you want to keep in mind. Next slide. So this slide provides some background just on the history of 45Q, if that's interesting. It talks about how the credit was first introduced, talks about a minor amendment in 2009, and then the 2018 amendments that has really significantly spurred on the activity that we're currently seeing in the carbon capture market. Next slide, please. This slide I put together to just kind of give you a sense of some of the legislative proposals from last year and this year, which currently are focused on what options may exist and what legislative ideas have been made, proposals to modify 45Q so that you can kind of anticipate what possible changes might be lurking as we look down the future. One is extending that January 1, 2024 deadline to begin construction. Some proposals are a 2-year extension, some are a 5-year extension. There's one bill that would eliminate that deadline altogether. Another set of proposals are focused on what some call direct pay, but is really what I would call a more efficient use of the tax credit. If enacted, direct pay would treat the 45Q credit as a payment of estimated tax, so that the owner of the carbon capture equipment would receive 85 or 90% of the credit value, or maybe even 100% of the credit value. This alone would be highly significant in spurring on additional carbon capture and storage activity. If this change occurs, it would be significant. One other proposal that's gaining some traction is a bill to eliminate the annual minimum thresholds that we talked about, the 500,000 metric tons a year for power plants, the 100,000 metric tons a year for industrial facilities. This would really level the playing field for all carbon capture and storage projects, regardless of their size. Next slide, please. This last slide is more of a resource for you in case you want to see where the major 45Q topics that are mentioned, where they show up in the statute and where they show up in the proposed regulations or the IRS guidance that was issued earlier this year. Next slide, please. So Patricia, I think that concludes the presentation. I see a number of questions are coming in. I'd be happy to try to answer some of those questions.
Great. Yeah, and absolutely. We've had a lot of questions. So, the first one I'm going to throw out at you, Keith, and we've got a couple questions around this. The comment regarding facilities that do not supply electricity to the grid being treated as industrial facilities as opposed to electricity generating facilities. And so we had a couple questions around, so if a power plant is located at an industrial facility, does that qualify? There's some questions about, some people phrased it, if it's in the fence, does it qualify? So maybe if you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah, good questions. So the key is going to be how the power plant is subject to depreciation and what classification it receives. And if you look back at the slide that we had, there was a list of 3 different classes that if the power plant falls within one of those 3 classifications for depreciation as a power plant, then it has the higher threshold of 500,000 metric tons. All others fall under 100,000 metric ton limit.
Okay, great. So another question we had, and I know we've had questions on this in previous facilities, about minimum thresholds and potentially putting facilities together. So this question specifically was, can 2 facilities that do not meet minimum annual thresholds be connected by a gathering pipeline to be considered a qualified facility? But again, I know that we've had various questions on this issue of, is it possible for companies to aggregate facilities?
It's a great question. You would think that you ought to be able to aggregate those projects together. Excuse me. The problem is that the statute talks in terms of a qualified facility. And so we're gonna have to find a way that even if you aggregated those together and aggregate those volumes together, you gotta somehow have a qualified facility. So if you have more than one qualified facility, then you're still stuck with the strict interpretation of the statute. There were a number of comments to the IRS on the proposed regulations that said, hey, we need some flexibility here. It's also an issue that is beginning to get some attention to at least some staffers on Capitol Hill. And so we'll see if there's additional clarity provided on that. But right now, there's some significant hurdles that have to be overcome in order to aggregate facilities to meet that minimum threshold.
And then there was a question again that relates to the thresholds. Is DAC the only option that qualifies for the lower threshold? I think you talked about utilization, but maybe you want to kind of highlight those both a bit again.
So if we're talking about the lowest threshold, the 25,000 metric tons a year, that is the threshold if you're going to store the CO2 through a utilization method, algae, chemical conversion, something like that. And that only applies if you're capturing off a facility that does not emit more than 500,000 metric tons. So that's a unique subset that only if you're using it for utilization and your source is relatively small. Otherwise, all the other facilities, other than the power plants, have to meet the 100,000 metric ton limit. I hope I made that clear.
I think maybe talk again about DAC and how that plays in and what that qualifies for.
So direct air capture specifically is 100,000 metric ton limit. Regardless of how the CO2 is used, the statute's very clear that the limit for a DAC plant, the annual minimum threshold is 100,000 metric tons per year.
Okay, another question we have is, what kind of metering systems are used to measure the captured stored CO2 quantity and calculate the amount of credits? Is there any certification needed for such measuring devices?
Yeah, good question. Some of the early notice from the IRS back in 2009 gave a little bit more detail about how things had to be metered. That was actually removed in the proposed regulations this last summer. There's industry standards on how gases are measured. You can use lots of different measuring devices, whether they're mass flow devices or just gas metering. It takes into account the pressure and the density and the temperature of the gas. But the statute, neither the statute nor anything that the IRS has published provides any restrictions on how that has to be measured, it would certainly be done according to industry standards. And for those instances where you're under an MRV plan from the EPA, there's very specific explanations for how those measurements are to be done and how those calculations are to be done.
We actually get this question quite a bit, asking which facilities are actually getting 45Q tax credits today. This question is it very common for electrical generation facilities, coal and natural gas, I guess, to seek 45Q tax credits? Do you want to talk a little bit, again, sometimes this comes from people outside the United States, about the process and how you would get it, and the fact that people aren't getting 45Q today because of the way the regulations have worked?
Yeah, there's actually been very few instances where 45Q credits have been claimed historically. Part of that was based on the older credit values were just not significant enough to generate the level of activity that we're seeing now after the 2018 amendments. In the power sector specifically, I'm trying to think if there are any power plants with carbon capture that have claimed 45Q credits, even under the old program. I currently cannot think of any. Some of you will think about the NRG Petronova plant, but to my knowledge, and it is that they have not claimed any credits to date, simply because I have not seen an MRV plan approved for the location where their CO2 was stored. That's what I'm going off of there.
Right, and I guess I'll just make the point that since these projects had to be constructed afterwards, so it's not so much that the tax credit's ready, it's these projects have to be new facilities. So we're just not seeing those online yet. So I think there's some confusion for that for people who are overseas, kind of that portion, that these are really for future projects, not existing projects.
I think you're right, Patricia. Very good clarification.
So we had a question regarding the deadline for starting construction. And on slide 23, we discussed kind of the capture equipment side. And the question here was, what about starting drilling of sequestration wells and surface facilities to pump it downhill? Would that qualify?
Yeah, interesting question. My memory from reading the beginning of construction notice, and I'm going to have to be clarified on this, but I'm going off memory here, is that doing the physical work at the field where the disposal or injection well is going to be drilled and is going to be active, that activity qualifies to start construction of the entire project, even if nothing is done at the carbon capture host site or at the qualified facility, because the IRS is taking into account the fact that the work done on the injection or disposal side is a significant expense that is being that advances the entire project as a whole.
Great, thank you. So another question, the process to get the new 45Q up and running has been longer than expected. You talked some about some legislation that is in place, including legislation potentially to extend the start of construction date. This question, this individual asked, what's the sentiment among project developers in general? How much has this slowed down the projects, and are there some projects at risk?
The delay, the delay in, for example, getting clarity from the IRS, I think for some people it has caused some hesitation, but I think for others, and I'll speak because we're a project development team, we've anticipated that the IRS would provide clarity at some point, and the statute has a fair amount of clarity itself. And we had a pretty good comfort level that the tax equity revenue procedure would come out sooner than later. And so I think many project developers looked at the statute alone and said, hey, this is significant. Let's start working on potential project here and there. I will say that in the investment community, there's some interest in making sure that the IRS rules and regulations are pretty clear. And so I think there was some hesitancy there, but once the tax equity partnership rules came out in February, that I think the tax equity industry began to dig in and is continuing to learn the space and get up to speed on it. But I think we have a fair amount of clarity now, and you can rely on the proposed regulations as proposed. So there's nothing really, maybe a minor tweak here or there, but there's not anything significant that's really holding us back at this point.
Okay, great. We have time just for probably a couple more questions.
I will just say one more thing. If we had direct pay, that legislation, that would significantly change this, and I think would be bigger than the 2018 amendments.
Right. Absolutely. So just time for a couple more questions. I'll kind of group two together. One was, to what extent are the geological storage site development expenses allowed under 45Q for characterization, permitting, et cetera? And then there was another question, what's a good rule of thumb of how much of the future 45Q credits can be raised to fund project construction? Also, if there are excess proceeds beyond which are needed to construct, capture, and storage, can such excess proceeds be used to fund transportation in the form of investment by capture or loan from capture?
Yeah, so on that last point, it sounds like someone's trying to dig in a little bit on how the tax equity partnership works, which is great. It can be complex. It can be a little bit complicated, especially trying to understand, at what point does tax equity get the return that they're looking for on their investment, or they're in for a certain period of time, and then they essentially, the partnership flips, and understanding when that flip occurs and when they can essentially be kind of exit their investment. I think tax equity, to my understanding, is they're interested in owning the pieces and parts that they need to own, which is just the capture plant, not necessarily the transport piece. And that was one of the aspects of your question there. And so any CO2 pipeline, there's flexibility that you can include the pipeline in the project if you want to, but I'm not sure that tax equity will always want to have exposure on the pipeline side either. And so it really becomes a negotiation with your tax equity provider. And so those are some of the thoughts that come to mind on those topics.
I'll ask one more quick question. Is there legislation in Congress and or the Senate to increase the 45Q amounts per ton? I think that's a pretty easy one.
Yeah, there are some, and we expect there to be some more. There's been some discussions about whether a certain level should be increased, or whether they should all be increased to at the same, the 35 and the 50, should they both be bumped up, or should just one be bumped up? Then there's also some discussion, I think, on whether the credit should be increased for certain sectors in industries. So it'll be interesting to see how the sausage making at Congress works.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. That was really interactive. We're not able to get to all the questions. I apologize. Keith will be back on day 2 for a breakout session. And in that session, you will be able to interact with him directly, turn on your mics, turn on your video, and ask Keith, certainly try to come up with your hardest question. We can play, let's see if we can stump Keith on 45Q questions. Just a couple points on the breakout sessions tomorrow. You should all have received an email. We will actually be going to Zoom meeting. This is a Zoom webinar platform. We will be going to Zoom meeting for the breakout sessions tomorrow. And that is at kind of the conclusion of the general session. And that will take place at 10:45 Central. And so at that time, We'll share a link here, but in the email that if you've registered for this event, you should be getting an email this afternoon that gives you that link to the Zoom meeting. It also instructs you to look at if you've updated your Zoom recently. So if you are below version 5.4 on Zoom, you will not be able to choose your own breakout session. We'll have 3 different breakout sessions available that kind of further the conversation from conversation topics we'll have in the broader session. So we encourage you to go and make sure that your Zoom is updated if you plan on participating in those breakout sessions. If you do have challenges the day of, we'll have administrators available to kind of answer questions, and we can move you kind of directly to sessions. But obviously we have over 300 people participating. If everyone asks to be directly put in the session, that's going to take quite a while and you might miss some of the content. So certainly, try to look at that email and update Zoom. We're going to give everyone kind of a 10-minute stretch fire break, and then we'll be back for more great sessions. There are some questions that I've seen that are really related to the business model of 45Q carbon tax. Is 45Q enough to advance CCS? And we're actually going to talk a lot about that in some of our sessions. So if you have those questions, know that we will kind of address those soon. But with that note, I'm going to give everyone a break. And if you could please come back at 2:45 Central, 3:45 Eastern for those on the East Coast. We will start up again the session then. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. This is Patricia welcoming you back to our last 2 sessions of the afternoon. I hope you'll stay with us as we have some great panelists and conversations that we're looking forward to. Just one kind of housekeeping issue. We have had a lot of requests as to whether this was being recorded, whether or not the slides would be available. This event is being recorded. We will put the slides and the presentation on our website, so you can certainly have access to that. Our next panel is going to be on the Louisiana Gulf Coast environment. We're going to talk about the industry and CO2 sources and some about the geology, pipelines, and transportation. So it will be a really informative session. My 3 panelists today are Elizabeth Abramson. She's a research analyst with Great Plains Institute who has done a lot of work looking at where CO2 sources versus sinks are, and how we can build this carbon management infrastructure within the United States. Brian's going to go a little bit deeper on Louisiana. He's assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Services at Louisiana State University. LSU has done a lot of work thinking about kind of opportunities for CCUS within the state. And then Dan Cole with Denbury, he's a vice president of commercial development and government relations. We'll talk a bit more directly about pipelines. So I'll hand it over to Elizabeth Abramson. Elizabeth, if you want to turn on your video and mic, and we'll move the next slide to our presentation.
Great, thanks, Patricia. So as you mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Abramson. I'm a research analyst with the Great Plains Institute, an energy-focused nonprofit based out of Minneapolis. In the next few minutes, I'll be talking about the work that the Great Plains Institute has done to assess what the potential build-out of a regional infrastructure network for carbon capture, transport, and storage could like in the broader U.S. And I'll zoom into Louisiana specifically to talk about how potential for CCUS in Louisiana relates to that larger regional network. We can move to the next slide. Thanks. So the Great Plains Institute embarked on a 2-year-long modeling process to identify where we can get started with carbon capture in the U.S. today. This involved identifying facilities that appear to be prime, near, or medium-term candidates for capture retrofit, identifying areas that are potential storage sites for captured CO2, and then modeling an optimized infrastructure network to connect the sources and sinks in a way that would maximize carbon storage while minimizing associated costs and land use impacts. To do that, we worked with a wide variety of institutional partners. You can see some of their logos on this slide, but one of our primary partners was Los Alamos National Lab. Next slide, please. Details of our facility screening process and our modeling approach can be found in our analytical white paper, which is on our website, carboncaptureready.org. And there you can also find state-specific resources on carbon capture opportunities and associated jobs and economic impacts of carbon capture. And we have some fact sheets that are specifically focused on Louisiana that you could check out. Next slide, please. Thanks. So with our partners at Stanford, we conducted a review of major emitting facilities, and we screened them for expected Section 45Q eligibility and potential to support carbon capture retrofit in the near to medium term. And for the purposes of our study, the near to medium term refers to the next 10 or 15 or so years. So all stationary emitting facilities that report to the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program are represented on this map you see here. The dark teal dots represent facilities nationwide that would be expected to qualify for the Section 45Q tax credit. And then those brighter purple dots represent facilities just in our mid-continent study region, which was the focus of our study. And those dots represent facilities that our screening process identified as having potential to support carbon capture retrofit in the near to medium term, based on each facility's operational patterns and emissions levels, among other characteristics. Next slide. There's vast saline storage potential throughout many parts of the US, as I'm sure you know. And in total, those saline storage areas have technical potential to store thousands of years worth of carbon at today's emissions levels. In Louisiana alone, there's an estimated technical potential to store up to 2.4 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. However, many potential capture sources throughout the country aren't located on top of geologic saline formations and would require transport infrastructure to deliver captured carbon to storage sites. Next slide. So our analysis identified facilities from a wide variety of industries as likely candidates for near or medium-term capture retrofit. Generally, those high purity and concentration of CO2 emissions in industries like ethanol, ammonia, and gas processing result in the lowest estimated capture costs on a per ton basis. But this graph and table show that many facilities in mid-tier industries do have reasonable capture costs when applying unit-level facility screening and right sizing of equipment. Next slide. We used Los Alamos National Lab's CCUS tool to model an optimized regional CO2 transport infrastructure network to connect identified candidate sources and potential sinks in a way that would maximize the amount of carbon stored while minimizing land use impacts and capital investments, as I've mentioned. And part of how the CCUS model does that is by avoiding over a dozen specific land use types, such as bodies of water, areas with high population density, protected resources in federal lands, and tribal and sovereign territories. And our modeling resulted in the transport network you can see here, which shows a vision of regional infrastructure that could become feasible with additional policy and financing support, as well as acceleration of carbon capture deployment toward the mid-century, so looking out towards 2050. Next slide, please. We see two parallel but interconnected transport corridors emerge in this scenario. In that circle to the left, we can see low-cost, high-concentration CO2 sources in the upper Midwest with limited local storage opportunities, aggregating captured CO2 in large common carrier segments for transport to storage and utilization sites down in Texas and the Permian Basin. And additionally, we can see multi-use corridors running through mid-continent states like Kansas and Oklahoma, delivering some CO2 to local storage sites, but also carrying out that longer distance transport down to the Permian. And then looking to the circle on the right, we can see multi-use corridors originating in those eastern Midwest states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, delivering some CO2 to local saline and petroleum storage sites, and also carrying out long distance transport down to Texas and Louisiana. Next slide, please. Using the NETL CO2 transport cost model to calculate investment requirements, our analysis found really clear economies of scale with those larger diameter transport segments. Depending on the business model, transport infrastructure owners will recoup investment and operating costs by passing costs on to users through transport tariffs. Segments with greater capacity and utilization achieve a lower cost per ton of CO2 delivered, resulting in a lower transport tariff for users. Next slide, please. So looking at a sample infrastructure network from one of our modeling scenarios, we can see a mix of CO2 delivery capacities depicted with the varying thickness of each line, and we can see the estimated transport tariffs labeled for each segment. So small feeder lines, like the one circled in the upper right, have a higher effective transport tariff, while mid-size and major trunk lines have transport tariffs that are well under $10, and in many cases under $5 or $1. Given that a typical user of a pipeline network would have to pay some combination or average of the tariffs along the route between a capture source and a storage location, most users would benefit from the lower effective cost per ton along those larger shared common carrier segments. Next slide, please. And we can see those cost dynamics at play in our larger regional network, where it's clear that shared trunk lines help achieve much lower transport costs than pipelines that were built for just one or a small handful of individual projects. However, of course, the build out of higher capacity shared infrastructure requires a much greater level of coordination and long-term regional planning. Next slide. In our mid-century planning scenario, we see around 33 million tons of CO2 flowing into Louisiana and the Gulf through those larger low-cost trunk lines, with additional aggregation and delivery from sources throughout Louisiana. Next slide. In comparison to scenarios designed to include only near or medium-term capture and storage sites, when we modeled a scenario that included sources and storage locations that may come online toward mid-century, we saw a doubling in the amount of carbon that could be stored with only minimal increases in cost and land use impacts. Developing supportive policies and region-wide coordination in the near term to support mid-century levels of deployment will allow us to take advantage of those clear environmental benefits and economies of scale. Next slide. So we focused on studying CCS infrastructure potential at the broader regional scale, but in the next few slides, I can share a bit about what we found in Louisiana specifically with our screening process. So we identified 32 facilities in Louisiana as near to medium-term candidates for capture retrofit, with the combined potential to capture 23 million metric tons of CO2 per year. I'll give you a second to look at this map and table. You can see a variety of industries there selected as potential near or medium-term capture opportunities. And then if we move on to the next slide, this slide here, we're broadening our view to include all likely 45Q eligible facilities in Louisiana, and we see a much larger number of industrial facilities coming online as potential capture candidates, where capture would be more likely closer to the mid-century. And these facilities here, which are all 45Q eligible, constitute 77% of emissions from stationary sources in Louisiana, which is a pretty big chunk. And then moving on to the next slide. So we saw on some of the earlier slides that Louisiana and the Gulf have potential to store captured CO2 from facilities throughout the mid-continent states. But here we can also see that there's significant near and medium-term potential for capture retrofit at facilities within the Gulf region itself, with 92 near to medium-term candidates for capture in the Texas Gulf, Mississippi, and Louisiana combined. Next slide. According to Los Alamos and Indiana University's sequestration of CO2 tool, there's potential to store nearly 2 billion tons of CO2 per year in saline storage areas with injection costs that are under $5 per ton in Louisiana. These low-cost injection areas you can see on the map shaded in light green grid cells. And additionally, based on data from Advanced Resources International, we could expect between 2.5 and 15.5 million tons of additional demand for CO2 at existing Louisiana oil fields per year. Next slide, please. So our modeling shows feasible capture from Midwest sources, resulting in the supply of 48 million tons of CO2 per year to the Gulf, and further supply from the Midwest that would be possible with development of additional CO2 transport infrastructure. Assuming up to 15.5 million tons of CO2 demand per year from Louisiana EOR operations, local demand for CO2 and EOR could easily be saturated by CO2 flowing in from out of state. However, the Section 45Q tax credit does create an additional market for CO2 storage in Louisiana's vast saline formations. In order to capture maximum economic and jobs benefits from carbon capture, Louisiana could prioritize developing CCS projects at facilities within the state, while also developing infrastructure to connect to larger regional networks that are bringing additional CO2 in for storage. And if you move on to the next slide, that concludes my presentation, and I'll pass it back to Patricia. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We'll invite Brian Snyder on. We will save questions to the end, so if you have any questions for Elizabeth, please type them in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end for Q&A across all the panelists. Okay, thanks, Brian.
All right, thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you, Elizabeth. That was a great setup. So I think I'm the only person on this panel who's actually physically in Louisiana. So I figured I might kind of pitch Louisiana and talk about why it's a little unique. Next slide. So we got a lot of reasons for kind of unique, great things about Louisiana. We have about 40% of the lower 48 states wetlands. We've got some very interesting architecture. We've got Cojo, who's not doing so well this year, but in normal years, or last year at least, did quite well, and he's sort of a state treasure, I guess. But we've also got some things that are kind of challenges for us. So next slide. So the biggest of those challenges, if you're from Louisiana, you've probably heard about is land loss. So South Louisiana is sinking into the Gulf of Mexico because that's sort of what deltas do over time. And so this is a map from our Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority that predicts what happens to Louisiana's wetlands over the next 50 years if there's no sort of change and no sort of restoration activity that goes on. So the problem with this is not just that the red kind of part of Louisiana sinks, but it's also what happens after that 50 years. So nearly all of this in this map is not due to climate change. It's not due to absolute sea level rise. It's really due to the sinking of Louisiana, subsidence. But after about 30, 40, 50 years, sea level rise is expected to increase dramatically. And so what will have happened is we'll already have sunk and sort of continue to be sinking at a pretty rapid pace. And then at the same time, climate change is going to increase absolute sea levels. So then we'll just kind of be in even a worse pickle than we are now. So that makes us probably the most sensitive state to climate change, the most vulnerable state to climate change. Next slide. And so that's pretty well known around Louisiana. And our governor, John Bell Edwards, this summer came up with a kind of a plan to address Louisiana's emissions. Now, I don't think anybody really expects Louisiana's this plan or any real other plan we could come up with to dramatically change that last figure, that red figure. There's other things that we need to do that. But I think people feel like if we're not doing something about climate change from a policy perspective, then we won't really have room to complain in 30, 40, 50 years when the situation is even more dire. So the Edwards plan is pretty ambitious. He wants to cut emissions by a little over 25% within 5 years, and then almost 50% in 10 years. And 100% by mid-century. So carbon neutrality for Louisiana by mid-century. That, like I said, that's pretty ambitious. But it's already sort of, I don't know if working is quite the word, but it's already beginning, I guess you could say. So just a few weeks ago, CF Industries announced with the governor's office that they intended to reduce their emissions. So CF, by the way, is our largest. They produce more carbon dioxide than any other plant in the state. They produce ammonia fertilizer along the river. They use some of that carbon dioxide already in the production of urea, but they're still a large emitter of CO2. And so they announced that they intended to reduce their emissions by 25% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So that's a pretty impressive commitment. And to do that, they're going to have to use a whole lot of CCS. Next slide. So another important reason why Louisiana is unique is the mix of our emissions. So over on the left, you have emissions by sector as sort of the national average for all states in the country. So most states, the average state emits about 33%, about a third of its emissions through the power sector, about a little more than a third through the transportation sector, and then the other third, 30% or so, is made up of commercial, residential, and industrial. So industrial emissions account for about 20% of overall emissions. Then if you look at Louisiana, about 60% of our emissions come from the industrial sector. And that's sort of a double-edged sword, sort of a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bad thing because that in many ways is the hardest sector to decarbonize. So transportation, in Louisiana, about 23% of our emissions are from transportation. We know how to decarbonize that. Elon Musk is like the third richest person in the world because there's a pretty cost-effective and now stylish way to decarbonize a lot of our transportation industry. Electric power, we have some ways to decarbonize that with nuclear and renewables. But industrial is particularly difficult to decarbonize. We're not going to get rid of our need for a lot of the industrial chemicals and products like the ammonia that's produced by CF Industries. So we're going to have to come up with some way to decarbonize that if we want to meet that 2050 goal of the Edwards administration. And really the only way to do that is with CCUS. So that provides sort of a huge opportunity, getting rid of that large pie piece in Louisiana is sort of a challenge and an opportunity. Next slide. So Elizabeth had some fantastic maps in hers, and I've just got sort of a simple one here. And so this is similar to hers. We've got natural gas processing and those little blue dots. The red dots are hydrogen, which has a bit lower carbon dioxide concentration in its exhaust stream. Natural gas processing and ammonia have almost pure CO2 emissions. Hydrogen's lower, it's more like 40%. And then the other petrochem in the black are kind of a mix of emission sources. So some of them, like ethylene oxide, are highly carbon dioxide rich. Other ones are lower carbon dioxide rich. And these are places that emit over 100,000 tons per year just in sort of process emissions, so just in those sort of higher carbon dioxide streams. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because Louisiana's emissions sort of clump into three areas. And I'm going to come back to this later. But you've got that sort of natural gas processing area in the north. You've got the Louisiana Chemical Corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans over in the southeast that has all sorts of different types of emissions. And then you've got Lake Charles. And so this kind of presents an opportunity for these different emitters to maybe work together, because as I'm going to show you, economies of scale are going to be really important in at least Louisiana's CCUS industry. Next slide. Okay, so now I want to transition to costs and whether or not the CCUS is sort of cost effective in Louisiana. So this is from a really good study by the National Petroleum Council that came out over the summer. And they did kind of a national look and found that there are a smallish number of currently cost-effective projects or systems in the United States that could be using 45Q, could be converted into a cost-effective project. But then there's this other large universe of projects that are not cost-effective right now, but if the kind of 45Q subsidy goes up and if costs go down with learning, they would expect that these systems would become cost effective in sort of the near term. So next slide. And then looking more closely at Louisiana, these are two tables from a paper some colleagues and I did, and they're looking at the cost effectiveness in terms of net present value of EOR systems specifically in Louisiana. So the numbers, so if you take a look at the table on the left, the numbers in that graph, I should have labeled them, are all net present value in $1 million. And you've got 3 different oil prices, which at the time I thought were conservative, that we would never drop below $30 a barrel, but I didn't see the pandemic coming, I suppose. And then you've got these sort of high concentration sources: natural gas processing, ammonia, ethylene oxide, and hydrogen. And so what you see is that in every case except hydrogen, the system generates an awful lot of money over I think we use a 25-year period, so in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is assuming you capture some emissions near the Mississippi River and move it down to an oil field called Parody, which is in South Louisiana, a little bit west of the Mississippi River. And then the table on the right shows sort of the same thing, but with a bunch of different fields. And this kind of time we're only looking at ammonia capture, and we look at some different distances. But basically the bottom line there is that as long as the field you're using for EOR is pretty large, so the smaller fields down at the bottom don't really break even. So the figures on the numbers all the way on the right hand side of that table, the negative ones show that, okay, well, those probably don't break even, or at least it'd be very risky. But the ones that are larger, the fields that are larger, we would expect to make a significant amount of money. Next slide. So then we're interested in, well, what happens with just storage? And this came from a kind of a national study, so it doesn't just apply to Louisiana. But what we found is that for these high purity sources, for ethylene oxide, ammonia, ethanol, and natural gas, the break-even point is around, say, 750,000 tons per year. So if you're emitting more than 750,000 tons of CO2 from ethylene oxide, from ammonia, or from ethanol or natural gas production, then we think under 45Q you would break even. Now we kind of fudged a little bit here in that 45Q has sort of a phase out or sunset provision after 12 years, and I kind of object to that from a thermodynamic perspective. So we modeled it with and without that 12-year sunset provision, and this is the without the 12-year sunset. If you put in the 12-year sunset, everything bumps up by maybe about $20 or so per ton. Next slide. Okay, so kind of to sort of sum up, is carbon capture and storage, utilization and storage viable in Louisiana? So I think it absolutely can be. That if you have some sort of large concentrated emission source, it probably is either cost effective right now or close to cost effective right now. And I think in the near term, costs will probably fall with learning. As I said, not a big fan of 45Q's kind of sunset provision. But the other thing we found from this is a lot of Louisiana's sources independently won't hit that 500, 700 million ton per year threshold. Many of them are less than 500,000 tons per year. And so we feel that there sort of needs to be some kind of cooperation, or we called it an industry-oriented project. So a bunch of emitters coming together rather than each individual plant doing it on its own. So if you think about sort of the model might be like industrial waste, right? One facility usually doesn't have its own industrial waste landfill on site. You get together with a whole bunch of facilities and they all manage their wastes collectively. I think that sort of model might apply here. The other thing to mention is that Louisiana has a particularly favorable, I guess, tax exemption, industrial tax exemption program. It's pretty controversial because the state sets it, but it comes out of the local property taxes. But that also does improve project economics. Next slide. And so then to kind of to sum up, or one last little piece here, Louisiana has a history of being pretty accepting of these sorts of projects. We do sometimes have some resistance to specific projects, but that is often not sort of a general resistance. Our overall kind of attitude is acceptance. I think it'd be particularly for a project like this, which has a benefit in terms of climate change, where especially here in South Louisiana, people are relatively aware of. So I think that's it. The last slide, I think, just says thanks, and there's Mike the Tiger. And I'll turn it back to Patricia.
Thanks so much. And we'll move quickly on to Dan Cole from Denbury, who will kind of share some about the pipeline aspect of what we're talking about here for the carbon management economy.
Hopefully I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Patricia. Next slide, please. Yeah, talk a little bit about Denbury. It's what we call our green line, and actually it's our Gulf Coast pipeline system. We actually have 4 different pipeline systems in Louisiana, Mississippi, and stretching into Texas. The green line, though, starts around Donaldsonville or White Castle, Louisiana. It's 321 miles of 24-inch pipeline. In-service capital was a little over $1 billion. The capacity on that line is approximately 800 million cubic feet a day. The ultimate capacity of the line will largely be dependent on where is the on-ramps and where are the off-ramps of deliveries. If you were just putting in 800 million at the very beginning of the line and trying to push it all the way through to the end, it would be difficult to get the 800 through without some additional capital being spent on pump stations. Pipeline cost, as you can see there, was about $3.2 million, and this line went in service back in 2011. Some of the work that Elizabeth presented a little bit earlier with some of the pipeline and some of the transportation rates possibly was done up in the Midwest. I'm not really certain, but we recently scoped another pipeline project for about 40 miles. It was a 16-inch line, and the estimated construction cost or in-service cost of that piece of pipe was almost $4 million a mile. The construction environment in South Louisiana, as you can imagine, and as Brian just indicated, a lot of wetlands. That creates extra costs when you're looking at constructing pipe, because you end up having to do a lot of hydraulic drills. You'll have a lot of matting. If there is storms, as there's been this year with a lot of wet areas, your construction budget can be blown very, very quickly. One other thing I would mention is that common carrier versus non-common carrier. This was a real topic of discussion during the 18 months I worked on the CO2 transportation chapter for the National Petroleum Council, is that if you are a common carrier line, you're effectively open access for anyone that's tendering CO2 to you for movement, with a projected delivery point down the line. For those early signers wanting capacity on the line, if you have to go into apportionment on that pipeline system, then that means that every single person trying to move CO2 through your system potentially is then venting some of the CO2. That doesn't do very much good for your 45Q program. If they were estimating they were going to be delivering you 1 million tons a year, they're anticipating you're going to take that 1 million tons and they would be collecting 45Q tax credits on that. If you have more CO2 being tendered for delivery than what you have capacity for, then that person capturing 1 million tons may be only able to get 900,000 tons through the line. So I think there's other ways around common carrier. But largely what it entails is that these lines will be built with commitments of capacity to them. And as that line fills, there will be other lines built, in my opinion. Next slide, if you don't mind. So Louisiana has an excellent eminent domain statute that for pipeline companies that transport natural gas, liquid petroleum products, and carbon dioxide, that they have the power to expropriate private property if it's authorized by statute. The property will be used for a public purpose, and it is necessary for the property to be expropriated. Landowners are entitled to just compensation that's typically set by the court. Procedures must be followed to determine what the value is and make an offer and provide information to the landowner to evaluate that offer. It's recognized in both statute and Louisiana Constitution. Expropriation or eminent domain is considered commercially a last resort when efforts to acquire necessary right-of-way becomes impossible, I should say. Next slide. Earlier this year, during the Louisiana legislative session impacted by the COVID virus, Senator Sharon Hewitt introduced Senate Bill 353. That was brought about as a result of Denbury taking a look at this storage statute and seeing where there was possibility of needing some changes to it that would make it more effective for not only a pipeline operator or someone looking to lay a new piece of pipe for CO2 transport, but also for the people that are looking to engage in the CO2 storage industry, as Louisiana is an excellent candidate for storage, for long-term geological storage. So this legislation was designed to improve the regulatory framework necessary for the development of the emerging CO2 storage industry. It amended the 11-year-old and unused Geologic Sequestration of Carbon Dioxide Act. It aligned the definition of interested party that was in the statute with the existing procedures before the Commissioner of Conservation. And we felt it was very important that CO2 pipelines that were transporting the CO2 get removed from the definition of storage facility. And then we also clarified the existing CO2 pipeline expropriation authority as under Title 19 rather than Title 30. Secretary Harris and his staff worked with us very closely. And there is a few remaining issues on this next slide. Is that clarification that the CO2 owner should or could retain ownership option of the injected CO2 into the storage site. The clarification of a shorter time frame for issuance of a certificate of completion that's consistent with substantial evidence post-injection provision of the federal Class 6 requirements. Clarification that either the project transfer or the certificate of completion for a project in good standing results in a release of all liability, not just the liability to the state, while ensuring that the trust fund performance for the state. Elimination of open-ended springback provision on the operator after a certificate of completion issued. If at an indeterminate future date, the trust fund is exhausted, how is that trust fund repopulated? Clarification of the requirement of cost and funding schedule redetermination for the site-specific trust fund upon project transfer. There will be some of this work will more than likely be taken a look at, I think, in coordination with the DNR and others once that Class 6 primacy has been obtained by the state of Louisiana. Next slide. So Louisiana has a very far-reaching and thoughtful, however untried, carbon sequestration program. The CO2 storage site project capital funding decisions will consider the statutory and regulatory alignment with all commercial principles, the clarity and certainty regarding project legal liability exposure and trust fund remediation funding requirement, and the post-injection monitoring and site closure time and expense and the post-certificate of completion. And the CO2 storage site development will drive CO2 capture and CO2 pipeline development. There's no question about it. So the first thing, some people look at it and say, well, if you have a pipeline, you'll get storage and you'll have capture and you'll have storage. It's actually just reversed, in my opinion. The storage sites are going to be critical because without the storage site, I don't see a lot of opportunity for use of this captured CO2 and enhanced oil recovery, just because of the volatility of the oil market and how low oil prices have been. Is that the price that an EOR operator would be able to pay as a commodity, the CO2 as being a commodity, is going to be challenged in this $40 or sub $45 price environment due to the net utilization of CO2 per barrel of oil produced in EOR in the Gulf Coast. The subsurface reservoir and geology is unlike what you find in the Permian Basin. Therefore, it takes more MCFs of CO2 to make 1 barrel of oil in the Gulf Coast as opposed to what you find out in the Permian Basin. And then one thing that needs to be said is that the Louisiana's legacy lawsuit issues is potentially should be and could be viewed as a risk to CCUS deployment development in general. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Well, I would invite Brian and Elizabeth to come back on screen with us here, and I'll ask a couple of questions with the time we have left. I'll send the first one over to you, Elizabeth. So it asks, on the capture cost, do you include the technologies needed to concentrate CO2 streams that come from combustion processes that have low CO2 concentrations? For instance, natural gas, boilers, et cetera, when you did your analysis?
Yeah, short answer, yes. The costs do account for separation and compression to pipeline quality.
Okay, and I'm sure there's probably more details in the paper as well, correct? A question over to you, Brian. Has the Board of Commerce and Industry gone on record saying that CCS would qualify for ITEP?
That's a good question. I don't think so, or at least I haven't heard that they have. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. Okay.
If anyone knows, feel free to kind of include it in the question in chat and we'll kind of group source the answer. Another quick one. Dan, is the Denbury Green Line a common carrier?
No, so the Green Line is not a common carrier in the state of Louisiana. It is common carrier in the state of Texas. And right now we do have capacity available in the line, but I foresee within the next 2 to 3 years, the line will be completely full. And at that point, we'll be looking to construct a new line.
Thank you. And we had another question for you about the Louisiana's legacy lawsuit issue. They asked for a little bit more explanation on that.
So there are legacy lawsuits going on against legacy operators or oil fields in the state of Louisiana having to do with, it's my understanding, the cause of some of the loss of land near the Gulf. And that, the suit is, I believe, looking at the oil and gas producers who operated down in the marshy areas to compensate the state or someone for the lost acreage or lost shoreline. And if that's not completely correct, someone from Louisiana, please jump in and clarify all of that.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions for you, Dan. And I'll kind of group a couple together in the interest of time. What's a good rule of thumb for the cost of insulated CO2 pipeline per mile? And what's a good rule of thumb for kind of royalty value to a pore space owner for 1 megaton of CO2?
So the cost of pipe, the diameter inch mile, I would say that you're probably looking at somewhere between $120,000 to $150,000 per diameter inch mile. Again, the environment you're laying in, and especially with all the wetland area, is going to cause that to be on the higher end as opposed to the lower end. To give you an idea, a line laid up in, say, Wyoming or Montana is maybe $1.2 to $1.3 million a mile. So there is a vast difference in the cost of construction depending on the type of terrain and the environment you're laying in. And the second part of that question was?
Is there a good rule of thumb for royalty value to pore space owners?
No, so pore space, that's another huge Pandora's box. As in most states, the surface owner owns the pore space. Then if you're looking at storage in a place that did have hydrocarbon production at some point in the past, you may end up be dealing with the mineral owners. A lot of times the minerals in the surface have been separated at some point. So they're two different people. But in general, when you're storing in saline or dedicated storage situations, the surface owner owns the pore space, and there will have to be some type of compensation, more than likely, unless the federal government determines there's some type of eminent domain for pore space because of the public good for storage of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's yet to be determined.
Thank you. We had a question earlier, and Brian, I'm not sure if you can kind of answer this from some of the work LSU has done. What's kind of the appetite or the thinking on offshore storage sites in Louisiana?
Yeah, so we're doing some work on that now. Let's see how to say this. It could work, but right now, the costs for onshore are prohibitive for most systems. So you'd have to have a pretty special justification for wanting to spend the extra money to go offshore. Yeah, I'd like to be more positive about it, but right now I think just tackling the onshore is sort of where we are.
Thanks. And I'll ask one more quick question and then we'll move on. It's back to Dan. Are there plans to reverse flow in the green pipeline, or would a new pipeline be used to flow east?
Yeah, so hydraulics on a natural gas line and CO2 line can have reverse flow, so to speak. It depends on the gas is going to flow to the point of least pressure. So if you've got valves open on both ends of the line, then the CO2 line is at pressure, then it's theoretically possible that you could be going both ways. But as far as you could have a breakover point, say the Lake Charles pump station. At the Lake Charles pump station, you could physically be moving CO2 to the west, and you could also be pumping back to the east as long as all of the pumps and valves were set up to flow back those respective directions. But right now, the flow is east to west.
Okay, well, thank you all. That was a really interesting panel. Again, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on. But thank you so much, Dan, Brian, and Elizabeth for participating in the event. We really appreciate it. We did have a couple questions on environmental impacts, on pore space versus surface estate, some of the kind of legal regulatory issues in Louisiana. I will deal with those in tomorrow's session. So certainly kind of stay tuned for that. We'll have someone from Environmental Defense Fund who will talk a lot about environmental impacts. And we'll kind of press Jason Landclose on some more pore space rights issues. But thank you so much for our panelists. I'd like to bring on our next group of panelists, which is Tony Catone from Oxy's Low Carbon Ventures Group. He is a Senior Director of Strategic Development. John Cruz, who's a Vice President at Hewitt. And then Brian Hill, who's a Vice President at Crescent Resource Innovation. So if all of those folks can have their video on, fantastic. And again, keep the questions coming. We really appreciate them. This session will have no presentations. It will just be this great moderated discussions with our group here. So I will start with the first question, and I'm going to send that over to John. John, can you discuss kind of the role of an EPC in a CCUS project, and then kind of walk through the different elements of a project, capture, transportation, storage, and then maybe talk even about the relative percentage cost of each element?
Sure, thanks, Patricia. So I think the role of the EPC contractor starts at the very beginning on a successful project. And the real key for the EPC is understanding what the developer needs to reach financial closing. In our experience in the projects that we've been involved in, it's been very important for the developer to have at the end of a study period or a feed period, a firm price that they can go to the banks with. And that takes a whole series of steps in order to get there. What's really important for us during that stage is to have a strong partnership with a technology provider. And in the jobs that we've been involved with that have moved forward and had success in that early stage, there's been a strong relationship between us as the EPC contractor and the technology provider to develop the design to an extent where we can identify and firm up that pricing. The other aspects during that early stage are understanding, how is funding being secured during that time. The technology providers are very sensitive to that, and having a firm path for that development stage to get to that financial closing is key. From a technical aspect, we're always interested in, how are the key aspects of the project being accounted for in terms of, for a post-combustion project, where's the water coming from? Where's the steam supply coming from, or power supply to provide the bones for the process itself? And so those are things that we like to understand early on in the project, and along with our partner on the technology side, enter into a study with an understanding of how are all the key elements of the job being accounted for. And then of course your offtakes. If it's a post-combustion power project, you're going to need power offtake. You're going to need the CO2 offtake. So kind of understanding all of those things early in the job is key to getting to a financial close. We were the EPC contractor on the Petronova job, and that period of the feed was about a year. We were teamed with MHI, and at the end of that feed period, we had basically a firm price and an EPC contract that we could move forward with. So that's kind of, I guess, the first key part before you get into any execution of the project is that year or approximate, maybe a year and a half period to define the project and to get the developer to a point where they can secure financing for the project.
Great, that was really helpful. And I probably should have mentioned this at the outset. One of the interesting things about this panel is that we have an EPC player here, a project developer, and Oxy Low Carbon Ventures obviously plays a dual role in terms of project development and owning facilities. And so we have kind of multiple different perspectives here on how do you get CCUS projects off the ground, and potential partners if you're an emitter who could think, who can help you think through that. Tony, I'll move over to you maybe to talk a little bit more about kind of the storage side, but also maybe we didn't quite get to kind of that answer when we think about capture, transportation, and storage. What percentage of costs are each of those? And then when you're looking at potential storage sites, both as a project developer and owner of a facility, what are some of the things you look for some people who might not be as knowledgeable about geological storage? And you're on mute, Tony.
I should be used to that by now. But anyway, a lot to unpack there, Patricia. Good question. So I'll start with the reservoir. I heard Dan Cole on the last group talk about how important that is. It's certainly a really important part of any project, and it's probably one of the least understood, I would say, by the market. In terms of getting a project done, I would say, I would put this into a couple of different groupings. It's securing the pore space, what pore space volume would be on that land, permitting and certification. So I'll talk about those three things. There's also engineering, design, and execution, but for the sake of time, I won't go into that. On securing pore space, really the project operator must have the sequestration rights to all of the pore space where the CO2 plume will travel. So you have to think geologically, where will this spread? So the pore space rights reside with the surface landowner in most of the country. There are exceptions and sort of lack of clarity in certain states, but in Louisiana, that's certainly the case. So what the operator is going to have to do is either find a large contiguous surface land area owned by one entity or family, or negotiate easements with a bunch of small little land owners at the same time, which can be challenging. I would say identifying the landowners and going through that process is very manual and certainly probably requires land specialists to shift through physical records. The operator needs to incentivize the landowner to work with them. So usually that's done through a royalty structure, but that's still all under development. Moving on to pore space volume. So what you're going to have here is a team of geologists and engineers that are going to model the geologic characteristics in that area and essentially predict the behavior of that CO2 over time of that plume during the injection phase. The aerial extent of the plume is what determines how much surface acreage is required, again, so spreading out across that reservoir. You're going to have enough pore space secured so that the CO2 plume stays within that area that the operator has rights to. So the operator should really consider securing enough area to also have some buffer space in there, I would say. The total storage capacity is what determines the useful life of the injection well. And obviously that injection well is one of the main cost of the project, as well as the injection rate. So the injection rate of that well is also going to determine how many wells you would need for a certain project. And that's the other major driver of a project. The last bit I like to talk about is the permitting and certification. So for CCUS projects, they're driven by government incentives for the most part, so namely 45Q tax credit and California low carbon fuel standard. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that on prior talks here. Projects must be certified under the EPA's monitoring, recording, and verification program and the California Air Resources Board if they are to qualify for both of those credits. So permitting is a long lead time process for developing sequestration sites. It's going to include a Class 6 well if you're talking about dedicated sequestration, and an MRV plan and a CARB protocol filing. So the project operator must prepare and submit all this documentation, detailed site characterization data, engineering designs, monitoring plans, and so forth. The monitoring wells required is also some of the highest capital project cost as well. I would say that the permitting process is pretty iterative between the operator and the regulatory agencies, and it could take up to 2 years to complete before construction can begin. So I think I hit on those 3 topics, Patricia, but you also wanted to talk about sort of cost structure. I think what was the other question here? Look, it varies. I would say there's a certain value pie here, and that value pie is going to be split amongst, I would say, the emitter, the midstream infrastructure, the capture facility there, transportation as well if it requires long haul transportation, and then finally the sequestration site. I think we can talk about this a little bit later, but there needs to be enough incentive to get the emitter to sign up for long-term commitments. There needs to be enough economics at the midstream facility and a capital charge essentially from the tax equity provider there as well. It's tough to comment on the exact percentage split amongst all those players, and we can sort of talk about what's sort of the friction that gets created by coordinating all those pieces.
Thanks. I guess one of the points I was trying to get to for people who might be unfamiliar is that typically just from kind of a cost basis, the capture side is, if we just think about the amount of equipment, et cetera, the capture side is generally the most expensive part of a project. So we'll talk a lot about sequestration, and certainly, I think we've already had a kind of a sense of some of the challenges on getting to kind of a robust carbon management sequestration site. But just, for people who are new to the area, kind of understanding that, generally we see, the cost of capture as the predominant kind of cost. And I would say kind of to that point, I had a question come in, and we'll kind of break from my prepared questions just to kind of get this in before we move on. I had a question, John, as to what is kind of the typical cost of a FEED study, which I know there's not a kind of a typical answer to that, but maybe kind of talk a little bit about, and some people may not have a great sense of even what a FEED study is, but kind of what that process looks like and what the cost could be.
Sure. And they can vary quite a bit. So typically in our experience, what we found during the FEED is we're helping the developer identify what are the sources of cooling water, power, steam as a input to the process. Then working with the technology provider on figuring out the exact configuration of whatever the carbon capture island is. Taking all of those inputs and developing an integrated design for the carbon capture island and the utility inputs, and then normally a compression component for the outgoing CO2, and then typically up to a battery limit where the midstream part of the project takes over. So would kind of go through, the inputs, the utility inputs required for the process, through the compression, and bring that design to about a 30% level in order to have enough definition on the project to have confidence in a price. That feed process is to the nearest $10 million, say $10 million. You know, it's in that range. The majority of that is really with the technology provider. They have a ton of work to do to, you know, really nail down that carbon capture island aspect. But it's around a year and 10 million, say, between the technology provider and the EPC contractor, not including owner's costs that are running in parallel with that.
Okay, thank you, John. I got a question from the audience. You know, does the United States have adequate sequestration for CO2? I'm going to answer that briefly. It's the type of thing that's really captured well in the Global Status of CCS report. And the answer is absolutely. The Department of Energy has done a lot of work looking at the available sequestration sites in the United States. And the United States is actually really blessed in comparison with other countries with a lot of geological sequestration to the tune of 2,000 to 21,000 billion tons, which really could store enough CO2 for centuries. So I just wanted to get that out there quickly. I'm going to again plug the status report. Let's move on though to some of these models of shared sequestration. And we've heard some reference to hub and clusters already. What are some of the considerations of these shared sequestration models versus one storage site per emitter? And I'm going to ask both kind of Tony and Brian to give some thoughts there.
Great. I think I'll start. And I've been thinking about an example of this. And so, you know, the way I think about this is, you know, I've been doing a lot of housework during the pandemic. And my wife usually begs me to hire a plumber or an electrician or contractor to do the work. I think it's sort of a similar situation here. You know, you should probably just hire someone that knows what they're doing here. It's really going to come down to that and having that skill set. Generally, I agree with my wife once I've, you know, ripped up the wall. So what I'll say is, like, look, the oil and gas industry is really the only industry that knows how to do all of these things and has the skill set to do it. When you think about capturing a gas from a pipe, compressing that into a supercritical state, transporting that on a pipeline, you know, drilling a well casing and permitting that well, and then knowing that you can inject that fluid, supercritical state fluid, into a geologic formation that is, you know, thousands of feet underground. And know that it's going to migrate through that rock in a certain way, and know that's going to stay down there over geologic time. So that's sort of the practical message I have in terms of looking at these projects and probably you know, hiring someone that has the capabilities and the data and the expertise behind it. Other things that I would just think about is, you know, there's a long timeline for developing a sequestration site. So sort of just that pre-work, that certification and permitting process, you're talking about a 2-year timeline, right? And then after that, you're going to have a construction phase. So you're talking about something that takes, you know, 4 to 5 years in certain cases. That's sort of that's definitely a long timeline for, I would say, just a single emitter to think about doing that, and instead not just contracting with someone that already has a site that's set up, that's certified. Remember, what it's really going to come down to is, if you're financing this thing in the tax equity market, is that tax equity investor comfortable that you're going to be able to sequester that CO2 and keep it there because of recapture risk for a long period of time, right? So it's really going to come down to that. The other thing that I would just speak to quickly, right, is the cost curve when it comes to sequestration. So you think about it, and yes, you're acquiring land, but you're also drilling wells that have high upfront fixed cost. And so there's economies to scale to these hubs, right? And so the curve is sort of flat, and then when you hit a certain volume, and you're talking about millions of tons of CO2 per annum, it drops off quite quickly. And so you're probably just going to get a better cost by doing this with a third party that has a hub set up.
Brian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess a lot of what Tony said is spot on, and when we look at it a different way, and when I look at it kind of a financial bent, and what are we going to need to do to get projects across the financing line? And when you start looking at hub and cluster structures, a lot of benefits come into play that are not there for a single point-to-point source. When you have multiple sources delivering to either one or more geologic storage sites or EOR facilities, you have flexibility if one site goes down. If you're in a point-to-point structure, if your storage facility goes offline, you cannot deliver CO2. If you can't deliver CO2, you're venting, and you're not getting that 45Q tax credit, so your finances are impacted. So having that flexibility to move to various sites to store or to capture the CO2 keeps the facility running at, kind of, we'll call it the optimal level that you need to pay back all of the debt and financing that's in place. The other benefit I think that, people are going to start seeing, we haven't really talked about it yet, but when you look at stack storage, so if you look at the ability to either store geologic sequestration, or if you look at EOR, it provides an optionality to a project where you can look at, is it more beneficial to use the CO2 because oil prices are very high for EOR, or if we're in a situation where oil prices are very low, do we just go for geologic storage? Again, that provides the capture and maximizes the credit that's available to pay off the debt for the project. And so having that flexibility to look at multiple ways to use the CO2, multiple places to capture the CO2, and keeping the project basically we'll call it fully utilized, is the biggest benefit, I think, to the long-term view of a hub and cluster structure.
Thanks. A question that I've gotten, I'm not sure if anyone here is going to be able to answer that, and if not, we're going to punt it till tomorrow. But the question reads, any idea what a pore space lease could look like? In Louisiana, what would pore space ownership subordinate or be subordinated by?
I wouldn't be able to answer that one.
Okay, so again, we might punt that to when we have kind of Jason and some other folks on tomorrow, but just wanted to try to test that. And Tony, I had kind of a question that was directed to you, but also happy to have someone else. What's a turnkey cost estimated for a 1 million ton per year wellhead?
Ooh, tough to know off the top of my head. It's going to vary. Are we talking about one injection well and then multiple monitoring wells, or are we talking about a tonnage fee to utilize a site like that? Maybe follow up in a later session. Yeah, I can help out with that.
Sounds good. Okay, let's move on then. And we had a lot of earlier questions during the 45Q session on, general, is 45Q enough to get projects over the line? There are questions on whether a carbon tax would be better than 45Q or regulation. What additional incentives are we seeing? So I'll maybe open this up to everyone to kind of say, is 45Q enough to get these projects happening in Louisiana right now?
Well, I'll start with the big one is just, it depends. And I think, it depends on, it depends on where are you getting your CO2 from to begin with. I mean, when we looked at, some of the slides earlier, and you look at, ammonia and natural gas as a cost of, $10 to $20 a ton for capture. And then if you have to transport it, and $5 to $10 for transport, another $5 for storage, yeah, that's under, the $50 for capture, and it's close to $35 for EOR. And, but, as you start going up the curve toward, post-combustion and natural gas and coal, $35 and $50 sounds like a lot, but it gets eaten up very quickly. And, the other thing that has been touched on with 45Q is the sunset. And if you're doing straight geologic storage, what is your plan in year 12? Because if it's not extended, there's no benefit now to putting CO2 in the ground. At least you're not getting paid to do it. And so, the tax credit goes away. Is there a carbon tax that would, potentially come into play in the next 12 years? I don't know, but it's very difficult to finance, a project for more than 12 years if you can only guarantee a revenue stream for 12 years.
Yeah, Patricia, I would just say that there are projects on the Gulf Coast that are in the money with 45Q as it stands today. I would say that the first movers are looking to also capitalize on LCFS as well, and that definitely helps a lot. And I think when you think about these projects, I think what everyone needs to consider, right, is that an emitter is going to be signing up for a long-term contract to continue emitting for at least 12 years, right? And so that emitter has to do a lot of work on their market and get very comfortable with the fact that they're going to continue to operate at certain volumes or else essentially pay a penalty payment to the capture facility. And so that creates some friction, right? And it creates cost. When you think about the capture facility, again, they're thinking about the market that emitter is exposed to as well. Are they going to continue to emit? And they're going to look for the financial assurances from that emitter that they're going to continue to do that, credit support, security, essentially to make sure that their midstream investment is safe. I'll also say that there is a cost to that capital for those tax credits, right? So they're being discounted by the tax equity partner. One way to make these things more economic would obviously be direct pay, if that was available in the U.S. And then finally, again, you have the sequester that is also signing up for long-term commitments, right? And so those are things that sequester has to consider in terms of signing takeaway sequestration agreements for both CARB and 45Q in certain instances, and what are the ongoing costs and potential liabilities there that might not be getting considered initially. So there's cost to all those things which start to eat at the value pie here for 45Q.
I would, from Kiewit's perspective on the jobs that we've been involved with, right now, the developers that we've worked with, they're looking at that 12-year timeline. So, like Brian said, what happens after the 12 years? Is there going to be something additional that would help the financial legs of these projects? As of right now, they've really are looking at that 12-year window. So I would say it's a challenge to make it go just on 45Q. It's obviously a huge part of the financials of these projects, but an additional revenue stream from a post-combustion kind of perspective, either if you're in a strong power market where you can get a revenue stream for the power, or if you're taking advantage of the EOR part of 45Q, if you can get a revenue stream from the CO2, that is an important part of the financials of these jobs.
Thanks, all of you. And I'll push on this question one more time to Tony and see if he's willing to go on the record. So would a carbon tax make these projects more, would that kind of stick versus the carrot make more projects come to fruition? And certainly as we're looking at a new administration coming in, that could be talking about carbon tax more aggressively. what is kind of your or Occidental's thoughts on kind of carbon tax versus these tax incentives?
Yeah, I'll talk about my views from looking at these projects and what would be helpful here. Yes, I think I'll say generally carbon pricing rather than just a carbon tax, so that can come in the form of some sort of market mechanism, whether it is a tax or a cap and trade program. You see that in California, right, where there is a state level cap and trade program that can further incentivize these sorts of projects. Same thing with LCFS, right? That's a great example of another incentive where there are pathways in CCUS to be able to generate those credits, and expansion of those credits is going to be very helpful over time to different markets. You have Oregon's already implemented their own system. British Columbia, Canada is also looking at an LCFS program. 13 states in the Northeast, Midwest as well. And from what I hear, there is potential for a nationwide federal LCFS program there as well. I think the other area that might be overlooked as well in terms of carbon markets is what's happening in aviation, and I think is also taking shape in marine as well, where you have a UN organization that's creating a carbon offsetting system where there will be pathways that will can potentially generate revenue, other sources of revenue for capture projects there as well. So optimistic on all these fronts. I think no matter which way the wind blows, there is a tailwind here for additional incentivization for carbon capture and sequestration.
Patricia, I guess just one quick thing. I mean, you asked about the tax, and if you kind of look at effectiveness of taxes, you can kind of look at the first large scale CCS in Norway, and that was a result of government taxes on CO2 emissions from natural gas processing. And now Norway has taken their knowledge from offshore geologic storage, and they're instituting kind of a very large offshore hub and cluster project. And but again, the effectiveness of the tax was what drove the oil companies to look into how do we store the CO2, and that's now the basis for a lot of the knowledge that people are going to be using for looking at offshore in other regions of the world.
Great. Maybe we'll move on. I just kind of moved to a new area. And we've talked about it already a couple of times, but low carbon fuel standard. So just for people who are unaware, that is, when we say LCFS, it's the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So California did implement a CCS protocol that is particularly attractive financially, potentially for CCS projects. Now that protocol is, as I said, associated with the low carbon fuel standard, meaning that it is only available for fuel pathways. So typically energy projects would not be eligible for LCFS credits. Direct air capture is also eligible for LCFS credits. We did have a question that kind of talks about, the Louisiana Gulf Coast is a good deal away from California. Does it still make sense to produce things that you would sell into California under the low carbon fuel standard in the Louisiana Gulf Coast? And, is the Louisiana Gulf Coast, will they be competitive against kind of other regions and/or say countries like Canada in potentially competing in California in these low carbon fuel pathways?
Yeah, I can start, Patricia. I think yes, Gulf Coast projects can compete, even though geographically they're quite remote. We've signed up on projects with biomass to fuel type pathways that make a lot of sense. I think. We have announced Velocis and a partnership there to be able to reduce the carbon intensity there and generate additional LCFS credits. Yeah, in general, I mean, there needs to be a nexus between California and that fuel. And so logistics can be challenging, but there's still enough economics that make these things work. I believe hydrogen production is another pathway potentially that gets you to low carbon fuel standard as well. And so that's another way of doing it. I think that's all I got there. Yeah.
And we will be talking some tomorrow in our case studies. Tony mentioned Velocis will have, they'll be here as well. And Lake Charles Methanol is going to talk some about kind of fuel pathways. So we'll kind of come back to this conversation on kind of fuel pathways and how Louisiana potentially could play a leadership role in the development of these kind of low carbon fuels. Just looking at kind of other questions I have here, and I have one, do depleted storage fields, converting kind of from natural gas to carbon sequestration, have a competitive advantage on the green sequestration field projects with permitting and cost conversion costs? And so, you know, I think you talked some about kind of capabilities for oil and gas. Do they have more capabilities because there's already been a lot of work done looking at that subsurface that could potentially be, you know, repurposed when you're doing your Class 6 well permitting?
I can start there. Yeah, if you can prove secure geologic storage in that old field, yes, I think you know, it's going to be a field by field basis, right? If the field looks like a pincushion, right, and you have a bunch of wells that require remediation, then it might just be more expensive than doing a dedicated sequestration and saline formation. So you'd have to think through that and the cost associated with making sure that it's secure.
Does anyone else kind of want to add to that conversation?
No, I think what Tony hit was very key, and that's, you know, when you start looking at existing versus greenfield, you look at potential risks, and one of the risks that, you know, we've been looking at and, you know, people are aware of is legacy well risks. You know, this all works because you've got a cap structure that's holding the, you know, CO2 below the levels of, you know, groundwater and everything. I mean, we're tens of thousands of feet into the ground, but still this cap, and every time you pierce that cap, there's a potential for a leak. And so when you're looking at, as Tony said, a well-developed field that has hundreds of wells, then you've got a lot of potential leak areas, where if you're looking at a greenfield structure, it may make more sense in the long run to look at greenfield versus existing from a risk standpoint, as well as just a cost standpoint.
It's a good point. Interesting perspective. John, I'll kind of ask you, you know, when you look at kind of timeline for these projects, and we've talked some about, you know, 12 years being a challenge, as well as start dates, when you kind of have to balance, when you're looking at kind of these project plans, potentially a Class 6 well permit and the time that will take, the time a feed study would take, the time construction would take, you know, what are the biggest kind of risks in these project plans for these projects you're seeing?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, being able to understand the timeline from when we're contacted by a developer to a financial close before the end of 2023 in order to take advantage of 45Q is a very important aspect, and you have to have time to do that preliminary engineering that I talked about in order to get a price. And then at the same time, there's all the permitting associated with the either sequestration or pipeline to an EOR field. That permitting string is a critical path typically, and you know, being able to understand, are we going to be able to have all the permits in place to be able to break ground on the project in time to take advantage of 45Q is a key aspect. And with every day that goes by, the deadline for starting the projects is not moving. So the time is now to be able to move forward and get that chain of events going in order to get a project closed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're at just about time. So I wanted to thank our panelists. This was a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate all of you for giving us your time today. Just like, I mentioned with the breakout sessions with Keith Tracy, we're kind of have a breakout session that continues along this conversation. Brian Hill will be leading that, and he's done a lot of work with developers in the state of Louisiana, thinking about CCS projects there. So if you have some questions that are very specific to your project that you'd maybe like to kind of get some free consulting kind of minutes of Brian's time, you can ask him those questions in tomorrow's breakout session. But we certainly appreciate all of your support at this event. So thanks, Tony, John, and Brian. I'm going to bring Jeff Erickson back on to kind of give some closing remarks. And just a reminder for you all, or if some of you weren't in the kind of the break for kind of the first break session, for those breakout sessions, you should have received an email today. If you had registered for the event, that tells you which URL to use. So at that time, we'll move from this webinar structure to a Zoom meeting, which will be more interactive. You can turn on your cameras and turn off your mics and have direct conversations with some of our panelists. If you have not updated your Zoom and you're below level 5.4, kind of that update, then you won't be able to choose your own breakout session. So we encourage you to do that tonight if you have time. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff to wrap up.
Great, thanks, Patricia. I won't be long, but I just have a couple of thoughts to finish up the day. First of all, Patricia mentioned early on this was originally intended to be an in-person session, and I would love to invite you all to a reception at the end of the day today. I'm going to leave that to your families and your colleagues. I'm certainly going to take advantage of that here, but nothing organized from the Global CCS Institute. You're on your own for that. A couple of things that struck me as I listened to the presentations today. First, Louisiana in particular is a state with good geology for CCS, but some challenging geography. They also have strong policy to support a very aggressive decarbonization plan at the state level. And so, this all plays into the feasibility of any particular CCS project. Second thing that struck me is none of these projects are a slam dunk. Every one of them has pretty significant challenges. Good advice, as Tony said, to hire an expert, or as Keith Tracy indicated on one of his slides, hire many experts to create a project team. It's not easy, but I think that the challenges and the targets, the goals that have been set out for net zero emissions are aggressive targets, whether they're by the state or by individual companies. They are not going to be easy. And so we do need to explore really challenging opportunities for deep decarbonization, and CCS is one of them. I'm looking forward to tomorrow because as challenging as the conversation was in some ways today, all the things that need to be considered. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from projects, from representatives of projects that are in development. They figured out a way to make or save money based on decarbonizing via CCS projects. So I'm really looking forward to that. That'll be the first session tomorrow, a set of case studies. And then the second session tomorrow is going to be challenges, identifying the challenges, not just challenges though, but solutions to those challenges, and hear from a pretty diverse set of perspective on things that are facing project developers. And then as Patricia said, we're going to wrap up with some breakouts that can enable a bit more intimate conversations among smaller groups of folks that are more targeted to particular issues they want to talk about. So with that, like Patricia said, update your Zoom version. check your email so you know what URLs to get to tomorrow. And thanks everybody for your attention this afternoon. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning. Have a great night. Bye-bye.